I beat the game. After 11 years, 3 hard drives, and 1 divorce that I'm 90% sure the game was not responsible for, I finally cleared Chronicles of Blade and Spell on the last save that mattered. Final boss down, credits rolled. And I sat there in my one-room apartment at 2 a.m., 35 years old, staring at a screen that said, "Thank you for playing," and I felt absolutely nothing. That's the trap with games like this. You spend a decade building something perfect. Max level, best gear, every secret found. And then you hit the end and there's nothing left to climb. The mountain's gone. You're standing on the peak with nowhere to put your feet. So I did what any reasonable, well-adjusted adult would do at 2 in the morning after finishing the great work of his life. I started a new game. Not a normal one. There was an update. Some patch I'd half ignored for months because I was too busy grinding the last dungeon. It added a new mode to the launcher, tucked under the standard difficulties, and when I hovered over it the screen dimmed like the game itself was embarrassed to be showing it to me. Abyss. I read the description 3 times. Experience gain. Times 0.01. Level cap. None. Starting bonuses. None. Difficulty adjustment. Disabled. This mode cannot be changed once begun. Let me translate that for you, because I've been playing these things since I could hold a controller. Experience times 100th means everything that gives you 10 points now gives you 1/10 of a point. A monster that a normal player kills at level 5 to reach level 6, you'd have to kill 500 of them. No level cap sounds generous until you realize it's the punchline of the joke. Sure, you can grow forever, but only if you survive the part where you can't do anything at all. And no starting bonuses, no free sword, no blessing, no head start. You wake up naked and empty in a world that has been playing on normal for 1,000 years and has no idea you exist. It was, mathematically, the worst possible way to play the game. I loved it immediately. See, here's the thing nobody who plays casually ever understands. The reward isn't the peak. The reward is the slope. It's the moment where you're weak and stupid and dying, and you figure out one small trick that lets you survive to tomorrow. Then another. Then another. Watching a number go from 1 to 2 when it cost you everything to get there, that's the drug. Normal mode ruins it because they hand you the number. Abyss made me earn the number, and I was tired of being handed things. My whole real life had been normal difficulty, honestly. Steady job, steady salary, steady apartment, steady microwave dinners, steady decline. I'd optimized a life the way you optimize a build you don't even enjoy, chasing efficiency toward a boss fight that turned out to be nothing but a quiet screen and an empty room. I looked at my actual life on my 35th birthday and it read the same as that game. Thank you for playing, and nothing. So when the launcher asked me if I was sure this mode cannot be changed once begun, I laughed out loud in an empty apartment, and I thought, good. Lock it, take the safety off. If I'm going to grind, let it be a grind that means something. I pressed begin. There was no loading screen. That's my first memory of what came after, and even now, decades on, it makes the back of my neck go cold. There was supposed to be a loading screen. A spinning icon. A little tip at the bottom telling me to remember to save. Instead, the light of the monitor smeared sideways like watered down glass, and my hands I remember reaching for the keyboard, and my hands weren't where my hands were supposed to be, and then the whole world folded in half and dropped me through the crease. I want to tell you I understood what was happening. I didn't. Nobody would. You cannot prepare a mind for the experience of being unmade and packed into something smaller, the way you'd wring a wet cloth down to a fist. Every thought I had got squeezed thinner and thinner until there was almost nothing left of Sato Ryota, 35, of the failed marriage, and the microwave dinners just a thin bright thread of me refusing to snap. And then cold. Cold like I had never been born into a body that knew warmth. Cold and wet and blinding light and enormous thunderous sounds I couldn't parse. And something clamped around me and lifted, and the first thing I did in my new life, the very first act of the great climb, was scream. I screamed with lungs the size of walnuts, in a voice I had never heard, and I could not stop, because I understood. Somewhere in the animal panic, the 35-year-old min-maxer surfaced for one horrible clear second and did the math. New game. No loading screen. Cold, wet, held aloft, blinded by light, and screaming with a body I did not control. I had not respawned at a save point. I had been born. They call the sound a newborn makes crying, but from the inside it isn't a sound, it's a state the entire self is the crying and nothing else exists. It took me a while, days maybe, to claw enough distance from the animal to become a mind again riding along inside it. The body slept most of the time. It couldn't do anything, couldn't lift its own head, couldn't focus its eyes past a hand's length, couldn't do a single thing but eat and sleep and cry and be carried. And I, the passenger, The thing that had chosen this lay awake inside it in the dark and tried to catalog my situation the way I'd catalog a new build. Item 1. I was an infant. Human, as far as I could tell from the two enormous faces that leaned over me. A man and a woman, both exhausted, both thin in a way that even a baby's blurred eyes could read as not enough food, not for a long time. The man's hands, when they held me, were a map of old scars and new calluses, and one of his fingers was crooked where it had healed wrong with no one to set it. The woman sang to me in a language I didn't know, and then, gradually, did know, the way you know things in a game where the localization patch runs in the background of your soul. Item 2. This was the world, Chronicles of Blade and Spell, from the inside. I knew this world. I had spent 11 years in it. I knew its map and its monsters and its economy and its long, grinding 100-year war, and I was going to be walking around inside my own encyclopedia. That should have felt like an advantage. Item 3 ruined Item 2, because I could feel it. The penalty. It's hard to explain to someone who's never leveled a character, but every gamer knows the feel of experience that little pull when a kill lands, that warmth of progress filling a bar. I'd felt it 100,000 times. And lying in that crib, half-starved and helpless, when the woman I'd already started thinking of as mother killed a mouse that had gotten into the grain and I happened to be watching, I felt the pull. And it was nothing. A thread. A drop into a bucket the size of the ocean. Times 100th. Exactly as ordered. The mode was real. The mode had followed me in. Which meant everything the launcher promised was true, including the part I'd read 3 times and laughed at. No starting bonuses. I had chosen the worst opening in the game, and the game had honored my choice down to the marrow of my new little bones. No blessing, no head start. No sword waiting in a chest. I was going to have to earn every single point of everything, at 1% the rate of the entire rest of the human race, from a starting line so far behind them, I couldn't see the track. I lay there in the dark and I did the grim professional thing. I laughed. Not out loud, the body just gurgled, but inside, where the real me lived now, I laughed with something close to joy, because this was the slope. This was the mountain. All of it. The whole thing. From the very bottom, where the air was thin with hunger, and the only asset I owned was a mind that remembered a game. Normal players started halfway up and complained about the view. I got the whole climb, every foot of it, handed nothing, owed everything. Good, I thought, in the words I'd thought pressing begin, lock it. The day they took me to the temple, I was old enough to hold my own head up and no older. I understood what was happening because I knew the world's rules. Every child in the human lands is brought before a priest in the first year and read. The priest presses a divining stone to the child's chest, and the stone shows the glyph of the child's talent, the gift the gods stamped into the soul at birth. Swordsman, archer, mage, farmer, even. There are humble glyphs too, and humble is a mercy, because the cast of a life is set by what the stone reads on that day and never changes after. A knight's talent lifts a serf's child into a lord's guard. A blank stone drops a lord's child into the muck. I knew all of this. I had read it on loading screens. What I had never done, in 11 years of play, was stand under it. The temple was cold stone and cheap tallow smoke, and the priest was a tired man with ink on his fingers and a ledger open on a stand. My father held me up. My father's crooked finger pressed against my back, steadying me, and I could feel the tension in his whole thin body, because a good glyph was the only lottery a serf ever got to play, and he was praying. I could feel him praying that his son might read as something that could carry the family up out of the dirt. The priest pressed the stone to my chest. I felt it go looking. That's the only way I can describe it. A cold, inquiring pressure, sliding through me, reading. It went to the place where a talent lives. And in that place, for one impossible instant, I felt something too, a flicker, a structure, a shape I half recognized and would come to know better than my own hands. A frame of light, a glyph. The priest didn't see it. I watched his face. I watched the professional patience curdle into a frown, then into the careful blankness men put on when they're about to deliver bad news to someone who can't afford it. He lifted the stone, pressed it again, harder, muttered over it. Turned it in the light like it had a smudge on it. The stone showed nothing. Not a humble glyph, not a poor one, nothing. Blank. The gift stamped into my soul was written in a script the holy instruments of this world could not read, would never read, because it was not their script, it was mine, an interface only I could perceive, brought from another world through a crease in reality by a man who'd pressed begin on the hardest setting. The priest cleared his throat. He wrote in his ledger. I couldn't read over his shoulder, but I didn't need to. I knew the word before he said it. The word that in this world is a stain you carry to your grave and pass to your children. Talentless. I felt my father's whole body change. Not anger, I want that on the record, forever. Whatever else happens in this long climb, I'm only beginning. My father did not go angry. He went quiet, the specific broken quiet of a man who has just watched the one door he was allowed to hope through swing shut. His arms didn't loosen. If anything, they tightened, drawing me a fraction closer against his hollow chest, as if to shield me from the word the priest had written about me. As if to say, he's mine anyway. My mother made a small sound behind us and swallowed it. And I, the 35-year-old min-maxer riding a 1-year-old body under a stone temple in a world at war, looked up past the priest's disappointed face into the smoke-blackened rafters, and I did the only useful thing I could do. I opened the math. 0 experience banked, 0 levels, 0 gear. A class the entire world could not see, in a caste that would spit on me from the day I could walk, in a body that would need years to even become useful, under a penalty that made a single level a mountain and a mountain a lifetime, in a land that fed its children into an endless war and would never once look my way to help. The worst possible start, exactly as I'd ordered. The priest handed me back. My father's crooked hand cradled my head, and he carried me out of the temple into a cold gray afternoon. His shoulders bent under a word that would follow us home, and I lay against his heartbeat and looked out at the world I was going to climb. Somewhere out past the fields there were grasshoppers, frogs, stray dogs, small, safe, stupid things worth almost nothing. Almost nothing. I felt the interface waiting at the edge of my mind, patient as I was, invisible to everyone but me. Level 1, I thought, was going to take a while. I could wait. The interface finally opened for me when I was 3. I'd been reaching for it since the temple, poking at that shape in my soul the priest couldn't read, the way you press a bruise to see if it still hurts. For 2 years it gave me nothing. Then one morning I was sitting in the dirt behind our hut watching a grasshopper, thinking with a child's stubborn boredom, I wish I could just grab you, and a pane of pale light unfolded in front of my eyes. Nobody else saw it. My mother walked right through where it hung and didn't blink. It was a menu. My menu. Text in a script that lived in my head and nowhere else in this world, laid out with the cold, ugly efficiency of a game UI. A level, which read 0. An experience bar, which read a number so small it was basically empty. And a single available action, highlighted because it was the only thing I could afford. Summon, grasshopper. Cost, 1 mana. I had 1 mana. I had exactly, precisely 1. I looked at the grasshopper in the grass. I looked at the button. And with the giddy care of a man defusing a bomb, I pressed it. The grasshopper in the grass didn't move. Instead, a second grasshopper shimmered into being on my palm out of nothing, identical, twitching its legs, absolutely real. My mana read 0. And when I stared at it, unsure what to even do, an instinct surfaced I knew. The way you know your own name, that this thing was mine, that I could unmake it, and that unmaking it would give me back a little of what it cost plus a sliver more. I dismissed it. It burst into motes of light. My experience bar moved. It moved by a nothing so small I almost cried. Here is the number, because I lived and died by the number for the next 5 years, and you should feel it the way I felt it. To reach level 1 from level 0, I needed 100 experience. A summoned grasshopper, called and dismissed, gave me after the times 0.01 abyss penalty, ground it down, 0.02 experience, 0.02 of 1 point. Do the arithmetic. 5,000 grasshoppers to reach level 1. I sat in the dirt, and I did that arithmetic in a toddler's skull, and I felt the whole scale of the mountain settle onto me at once. And then I did the thing that separates a min-maxer from a normal person. I started counting to 5,000. The trouble wasn't the grasshoppers. Grasshoppers were free, endless, everywhere in the summer grass. The trouble was mana. I had 1 mana at first. 1. It came back slowly. Over hours I timed it by the sun the way a prisoner times things, and worked out it refilled about 1 point every couple of hours while I was awake, faster while I slept. So on a good day I could summon and dismiss maybe 8 or 9 grasshoppers, harvest maybe a fifth of a point of experience, and go to bed having advanced up the mountain by the width of a hair. But mana grew. That was the secret nobody in this world knew about me, the quiet engine under everything. Every summon and dismiss didn't just give experience, it stretched the vessel a little. Muscles you use get stronger. My mana pool crept upward, 1 point then 2, then over the seasons a slow, steady climb, until by the time I was 4 I could hold and spend a couple dozen mana across a day. And here's where the middle-aged man in the toddler's body earned his keep. A normal child, given a magic button, would have mashed it. I made a spreadsheet in my head. If mana grows from use, then the correct play isn't to summon the cheapest thing and hoard, it's to keep the pool empty and cycling all day long, summoning and dismissing on a rhythm as steady as breathing, so the vessel is always under load. Every idle minute was mana regenerating into a pool I wasn't using, which was waste, which in a min-maxer's soul is a small physical pain. So I became, to everyone in the village, the strange quiet boy who sat in the grass alone all day doing absolutely nothing. That part was armor. I want to be clear about that, because it mattered more than the grasshoppers. A talentless serf's child in a world of castes has exactly one safe move, and it is to be beneath notice. If I'd shown a spark of anything unusual, the questions would start, and questions from priests and lords do not end well for a boy the stone red blank. So I built the mask deliberately. Harmless, useless, a little slow, a little dreamy. The unlucky child who plays in the dirt. Nobody watches the unlucky child. Nobody expects anything of him, which means nobody ever checks. The village mostly obliged me by forgetting I existed. Mostly. Ganta did not forget I existed. Ganta made a hobby of remembering. The blacksmith's son was a year older, a head taller, and built like the anvil his father worked. He'd been read at the temple too, and the stone had lit up bright for him axeman, a real fighting talent. The kind that could someday buy a serf's son a place among a lord's soldiers. He knew what he was, and he made sure everyone else knew it too, loudest of all around the boy the stone had read as nothing. "Look at him," he'd say, planted over me with a knot of other village kids at his back. "Just sitting, that's all the talentless can do. Sit and eat what the rest of us grow." He'd kick dirt onto my legs, waiting for me to cry or swing, and get bored when I did neither. I didn't hate him. That surprised me. From the inside of 35 years I could see Ganta clearly, a scared kid clinging to the one good thing the world had handed him, terrified that if he stopped being loud about it, it might turn out not to be enough. I filed him under later and kept summoning grasshoppers behind my own blank face while he shouted at it. The one who didn't leave me alone in the good way was Homura. She was my age, the daughter of another serf family down the lane, and the stone at the temple had done something for her I'd only ever seen described on loading screens. It had flared, they said, bright enough that the tired priest sat up straight. Top-rank swordsman talent, in a serf child. It was the kind of luck that gets a whole family talked about, and it should have made her insufferable, another Ganta. Instead, she decided, for reasons known only to the mind of a 4-year-old, that the strange quiet boy who sat in the grass was her personal responsibility. "Why do you always sit here?" she demanded, dropping cross-legged in front of me the first day, blocking my view of a very promising patch of grasshoppers. "I like the grass," I said. "That's boring." She considered me with the frank, merciless attention only small children and interrogators possess. "Ganta says you're useless." Ganta's probably right. That stopped her. She'd expected a fight, maybe tears, the reactions Ganta trained everyone to expect. She got a small, tired man agreeing with his own insult, and it broke her small brain a little, and I'd learned this was very Homura. It made her decide I was interesting, which to Homura meant hers. "You're not useless," she announced, like she was overruling a court. "You're just weird. Show me a game." I didn't have a game. So I picked a grasshopper out of the grass, a real one, not summoned, and taught her to hold it gently so it wouldn't jump, and she was delighted. And while she was delighted and watching the real one, I quietly summoned and dismissed 6 more in my other hand, harvesting a whole fat 1/10 of a point off her distraction. She came back the next day, and the next. She was the only person in the village who looked at the blank stone boy and saw a person instead of a stain, and I have never in 2 lifetimes forgotten it. The years were long. I won't pretend they weren't. There's a particular loneliness to grinding a bar that moves at 1/100th speed while everyone around you lives at full speed. Ganta grew. His talent unfolded early the way talents do by 5. He could swing his father's smallest hatchet with a strength no ordinary child had, because the gods. Gift did half the work for him. Homura grew. She picked up a stick like a sword and knew things about it that no one taught her, angles and footwork bleeding out of the glyph in her soul, and the village started saying she'd be a knight someday. A real one. They were handed their numbers. I earned mine 200ths at a time. And I want to tell you it never got to me, that the middle-aged mind was above envy, but I'd be lying, and I promised the number I'd be honest about the number. There were nights I lay on the straw beside my parents, listening to my father's cough, a wet cough that got worse each winter. The cough of a man whose body was a tool the barony wore down to feed its quotas, and I looked at my experience bar glowing in the dark where only I could see it. Still shy of level 1 after 2 years of daily grinding, and I felt the whole crushing arithmetic of it and wanted very badly to quit. Then I'd remember why I chose this, not the game, The slope. The whole reason I pressed begin was that I was sick to death of being handed a life and feeling nothing. Well, nobody was handing me anything now. Every hundredth of a point I dragged out of the grass was mine in a way nothing in my old life had ever been mine. It cost me, and because it cost me, it counted, so I diversified. Frogs when I could get to the stream worth more than grasshoppers, but the summon cost more mana, and the math on cost per experience actually favored them once my pool got big enough to afford the cycle. I ran the numbers on everything I could summon, and I mean ran the numbers, ranking every creature the interface offered me by experience per mana and time per cycle, optimizing the grind like a factory line. Grasshoppers early, frogs at the stream, and by the time I was 6, a new tier unlocked that changed the shape of the whole climb. Summon. Stray dog. A dog cost real mana, more than I'd had for years. But a dog gave real experience, 10 times a frog, and a dog could do something a grasshopper couldn't. It could hunt. I couldn't hunt yet. My 6-year-old body was too weak, and a talentless serf's child creeping around with prey would raise exactly the questions I'd spent my whole life avoiding. But a summoned dog, dismissed before anyone saw it, that killed a rat or ran down a rabbit in the brush at the wood's edge. That fed a whole separate stream of experience I could harvest in the dark, unseen, while the village slept and thought the unlucky boy was sleeping too. I stopped sleeping much. The body hated it. I made the body do it anyway. The chime came in the deep cold of the winter I turned 8. I was crouched at the tree line past the last field, well after dark, wrapped in every rag I owned against a cold that bit to the bone, and yes, I'd learned the hard way to eat first and keep moving out there, because a min-maxer who freezes to death has optimized nothing. I had a summoned dog out in the brush, a lean gray thing running down a rabbit through the frozen bracken, and I was riding the edge of exhaustion and the edge of my mana both, cycling summons the way I had every single day for 5 years, counting, always counting. The dog caught the rabbit. The experience trickled in, the same worthless thread it always was, filling a bar I'd watched crawl for half a decade, and I almost didn't notice when it topped out because I'd stopped believing, on some animal level, that it ever would. The pane of light flared. New text, gold instead of pale, hanging in the freezing dark where only I could see it. Level up, level 1. I knelt in the snow at the edge of the wood, 8 years old, 5 years, and I couldn't guess how many thousands of grasshoppers and frogs and dogs behind me, and I stared at the single most worthless milestone in the entire game. Level 1. The place normal players start their first afternoon. The floor. The doormat of the mountain. I put my face in my frozen hands and I laughed until I cried, and I couldn't have told you which one was winning. Because I knew what nobody else in this world knew. I knew what no cap meant on the far side of this floor. I knew that every player who started at level 1 in a comfortable afternoon had a ceiling somewhere up ahead, a soft cap where the game gently told them, this is high enough. I had no ceiling, none. The same penalty that had buried me for 5 years in the dirt was the price of a road with no end at the top of it, and I had just, finally, painfully, set my foot on the first stone of it. There was one more thing the freezing dark taught me that night, and I filed it careful because it would matter more than any grasshopper. The interface, when it finally gave me my level, showed me the shape of how experience worked, and the small safe creatures I'd been grinding weren't the whole scale of it. Big things, dangerous things, paid on a different curve entirely, their experience scaled to the threat they posed, so that even ground down by the times 100 penalty a single true monster could be worth as much as thousands of grasshoppers stacked together. 5,000 bugs to reach level 1, but one large, deadly thing, killed clean, could be worth the whole of it, and more in a single stroke. It didn't help a body too weak to fight anything large. But I filed the rule away, whole, because a min-maxer who understands the payout table understands where the mountain gets steep in his favor, and someday I'd be strong enough to stand in front of something worth thousands. My mana pool had grown enormous compared to that first single point. My summon list ran 3 tiers deep. My grind was a machine, ruthless and tuned. And the bar for level 2 opened up in front of me, longer than the last, and I looked at it not with despair, but with something I hadn't felt clean and pure since I was a young man staring at a screen that said, "Thank you for playing." I felt the slope under me. I dismissed the dog, banked the last thread of experience, and started counting toward 2. The bird came in the spring I was 9, and it came for the goats. I heard the whole village before I understood it, a scream from the pasture at the top of the lane, then old Mother Sina shrieking, then everyone running the wrong way, the way people always run when a thing is bigger than their idea of what a bird can be. By the time I got up the slope on my short legs, it was already climbing away with a full-grown nanny goat hanging limp in its talons, and the whole village stood in the mud with their necks craned back, watching a fortune fly off into the mountains. I knew what it was before I saw the shape clear. I'd killed 100 of them in the old life, in fights that lasted 8 seconds. A ruck hawk. A raptor the size of a farm cart, brown-barred wings that threw a shadow you could stand in, talons that could carry off a calf. In the game, it was an early zone menace, a warning to green players to stay near town. For a village of half-starved serfs, it was the end of the world, because every goat and lamb it took was tribute we still owed the Baron whether the beast ate it or not, and a village that fell short of its quota didn't get sympathy. It got soldiers. I stood at the back of the crowd, small and unnoticed as ever, and I felt 2 things at once. The first was fear, because a ruck hawk could kill me without noticing I existed. The second was the pull. Every gamer knows it. That thing was a walking experience jackpot, the single largest deposit of the stuff to wander within reach in the 9 years I'd been grinding 2/100ths of a point at a time out of the grass. If I could kill it, I'd leap levels in one night. If. And here I want to set down a rule I'd learned that changed how I saw every kill after, because it's the thing that makes the whole climb possible. Big monsters don't obey the same arithmetic as the grass. A grasshopper paid 2/100ths of a point, 5,000 of them to reach a single level, but experience scaled with threat, so that even ground down by the times 100 penalty a true monster paid on a wholly different curve. A rook hawk, killed clean, was worth as much as thousands of grasshoppers stacked together, not because the penalty relented, but because the beast itself was a mountain of experience, and 1% of a mountain is still a hill. That was the loophole under the loophole. The penalty buried me in the grass for 5 years. It could not bury a jackpot the same way. I'd hit level 4 over the winter. My summon list ran deep now. My mana pool was a real reservoir, and I could hold a dozen dogs at once if I emptied everything into them. And it wasn't enough. I want to be clear about that, because this is the whole shape of my life at 9 years old. 12 summoned dogs against a ruck hawk was 12 dogs getting scattered like leaves. I could not fight this thing. Not in a straight line. Nobody in the village could. The men had spears and one rusty bow, and the bird flew. But I'd killed 100 of them, and I remembered how they worked. Here's what a ruck hawk is underneath the terror. It's a hunter that owns the sky and knows it. It doesn't fight. It swoops, snatches, and climbs away, because on the ground and in a tangle it's clumsy and slow. Its whole power lives in the dive. Break the dive, force it low, keep it grounded in a mess it can't launch out of, and the god monster becomes a big angry turkey with knives on its feet. Dangerous, but killable, if you're the thing standing in the exactly right place at the exactly right second. I also remembered the tell. Before a rook hawk commits to a dive, it fixes on the target and stops flapping a half-second glide, wings locked, the whole body aimed like an arrow drawn back. In the game, that was your window to dodge. In my life, it was going to be my window to do the opposite of dodge. And I remembered the eyes. A raptor lives by its eyes. A raptor that can't see, can't dive. I had the plan fully built in my head before I'd walked back down the lane. The problem was that a 9-year-old talentless surf boy cannot stand up in front of the village and announce he intends to kill the monster. That road ends in questions I couldn't survive, so I did what I'd done for 5 years. I let them decide it was hopeless, watched the men mutter about sending word to the Baron and waiting for soldiers who wouldn't come, and I went to do it in the dark, alone, where nobody would ever know. Well, almost alone. "You're going to do something stupid," Homura said. She'd caught me at the goat pen at dusk, laying out my bait, a lamb that had died that morning of a chill, which I'd begged off Mother Sina with a story about wanting to bury it. Homura was 9 now too, and a full head of trouble, and the stick she carried everywhere had become a proper wooden practice sword her father had cut for her. She stood over my dead lamb with her arms crossed and her frank, merciless eyes narrowed. "I'm burying it," I said. "You're the worst liar in the whole world." She said, which was untrue. I was an excellent liar. I'd been lying to an entire village for 5 years, but I let her have it. "You're going to try and kill the bird, on your own, because you're stupid." There was no point. She'd have followed me anyway. She always did. "If you tell anyone," I said, "it won't work." She looked at me for a long moment. Then, instead of running to tell the adults, she planted her wooden sword point down in the mud and sat on an upturned bucket to watch, and said, "Then I'm helping." What do I do? I could have argued. I looked at her, the one person in 9 years who'd seen a person instead of a stain, and I decided the mask could have one hole in it, just one, and it might as well be her. "You stay behind the wall," I said, "and you don't come out no matter what. And you never, ever tell anyone what you see." "Boring," she said. "But fine." The rookhawk came back at dawn, the way I knew it would. They work a territory, and a village of easy goats was the best territory it had found in years. I'd staked the dead lamb in the open at the top of the pasture, in the flat where the bird would have room to dive and no room to think twice. I lay in the wet grass at the tree line with Homura crouched behind the low stone wall of the goat pen, and I had my whole reservoir of mana held ready, and I waited, and my heart was going so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The shadow crossed the field first. Then the bird huge, unhurried, riding a slow circle to be sure the ground was empty of the things that killed birds. It saw the lamb. It saw no men, no spears, no dogs, a dead lamb and an empty field. Then it fixed, wings locked, the half-second glide, body drawn back like an arrow. Now, I summoned the swarm. Not dogs, I'd unlocked something better for exactly this over the winter, grinding it in the stream mud, a summon that came out of the interface as a boiling gray-black cloud, a swarm of biting midges and gnats, cheap per unit and useless for damage but thick, and I dumped a full third of my mana into it all at once so it burst into the air over the lamb as a churning wall of insects the size of a hut. The bird hit the cloud mid-dive. You cannot dive through a wall of gnats and see. I'd bet my life on that literally, and the bet paid. The rookhawk's whole world went from a clean target to a stinging blindness in its eyes and beak and the wet membranes of its face, and its beautiful killing dive turned into a panicked, graceless crash, wings hammering, talons grabbing at ground it could no longer see. It came down in a thrashing heap 10 feet from the lamb, screaming, half-blind, exactly where a rookhawk is at its weakest, grounded, tangled, unable to launch. I dumped everything else I had into dogs. 9 of them, the biggest I could summon, boiling out of the light in a ring around the flailing bird, and they did the one job a pack does better than anything on earth. They harried it low. They didn't try to kill it. They darted at the wings, at the tail, worrying, snapping, denying it the 2 seconds of clear space and clear sight it needed to get airborne. Every time it gathered itself to leap, a dog was at its feathers and it flinched back down. The gnats kept it half-blind, the dogs kept it grounded. And the whole clockwork of the thing held together for the 4 or 5 seconds I needed it to. Because the dogs and the gnats were never going to kill a rookhawk, I knew that. I'd known it laying out the lamb. They were the setup. They existed to freeze one giant, deadly, panicking animal in one exact spot with its head down and its eyes streaming. I came out of the grass with my father's boar spear. I'd taken it that morning from the peg by our door, the one weapon in our hut worth anything. A heavy hunting spear with a crossbar behind the head to stop a charging boar from running itself up the shaft to gore the man holding it. I was 9 and small, and it was almost too heavy to run with. It didn't matter. I didn't need to fight the bird. I needed to be the thing standing in the exactly right place at the exactly right second. And everything I'd built 5 years of grind, a reservoir of mana, a swarm, a pack, a boy behind a wall keeping the field empty of witnesses, all of it existed to buy me this one moment where a blind, grounded monster had its neck stretched low and its whole attention on the dogs. I put the spear where a rookhawk's life runs closest to the skin, the soft hollow at the base of the throat, and I put my whole 9-year-old body and every ounce of my running weight behind it, and the crossbar was the only reason I lived because the bird convulsed and drove itself down the shaft toward me in a spasm of dying fury, and the bar caught at a hand's width from my hands, and its beak snapped shut on empty air a finger from my face. Then it stopped. The whole enormous body went slack in the wet grass. One wing flung out across the lamb it had come to steal, and the field was suddenly, ringingly silent, except for my own breath sawing in and out and the ache in my arms where the spear had nearly torn free. The interface lit up so bright it whited out the morning. Level up, level up, level up, 4 levels. 4 in one strike, from a single kill worth more than every grasshopper and frog and dog of the last 5 years stacked together because a true monster pays on the threat curve, and even at 1% of a mountain is a great deal of ground. Level 4 to level 8 in the time it took a bird to die. I knelt in the grass with my father's spear still buried in the thing's throat, shaking, and I watched the numbers climb, and I understood something I would build the rest of my life on. The grind got me the mana, the knowledge got me the kill. And the gap between what my level said I could do and what I could actually do, that gap was the whole game. That gap was where I was going to live. I dismissed the dogs before they'd finished cooling, the gnat cloud I'd already let disperse. In 30 seconds, there was nothing in that field but a dead 9-year-old's nightmare of a bird and a boy far too small to have killed it, and a spear his father would ask about. That, said Homura from behind the wall in a voice gone very small, was not burying a lamb. She came out slow, staring at the corpse, staring at me, and I watched her try to fit what she'd seen into a 9-year-old's picture of the world and fail. She didn't understand summons. She didn't understand mana. She'd seen a cloud of bugs and a ring of dogs appear from nowhere around the boy the stone had read as nothing, and vanish the same way, and the impossible bird lying dead at his feet. "You can't tell anyone," I said again. "Homura, please." She looked at the bird. She looked at me. And whatever was in her face wasn't the fear I'd braced for. It was something worse and better, the thing that would make her chase me my whole life. "You're not useless," she said, fierce and quiet, like she was daring the world to argue. "You're the strongest person in the whole village and you hide it. Why do you hide it?" I didn't have an answer she could carry safely at 9. So I gave her the truth in the only size that fit. "Because if they see what I am," I said, "they'll take it from me. That's how the world works for people like us. You keep the good things secret until you're too strong for anyone to take them." She thought about that longer than a child should have to. Then she nodded, once, and put her small hand flat on the dead bird's warm feathers like she was swearing an oath on it. "Secret," she said. "But someday you're going to fight me for real, when you're not hiding, promise." "Someday," I agreed and meant it, and had no idea how long someday would be. We told the village a story, and the story was better than the truth. I let the men find the bird an hour later, with my father's spear in its throat, at the top of the pasture. I let them build the tale themselves, a spear staked in the ground, a trap of some clever kind, the beast impaling itself in a dawn dive at the lamb. They wanted a story where luck and a farmer's cunning had killed the monster, because that was a story a village could live inside. And I gave it to them by simply saying nothing at all, which I was very good at. My father turned his crooked spear over in his hands for a long time that evening, running his thumb along the crossbar where the paint was scored down to bright metal, and he looked at the peg by the door where it had hung untouched that morning, and he looked at me. He didn't say anything either. But something moved behind his tired eyes, a question he set down carefully and did not ask, and I understood that my father was not as easy to fool as a whole village, and filed that under later too. The bird was worth a season of goats. Its feathers, its talons, its meat the village ate for a week and had trophies to trade. For 7 days there was almost enough, and my father's wet cough eased in the warmer air, and Homura kept my secret and my mask held. And in the dark that night, with everyone asleep, I opened my menu and looked at the number that had cost me a bird's dying lunge a finger from my face. Level 8, still nothing, on the scale of the world. A boy could be born with a talent that made him worth more than my 8 levels the day the stone touched his chest. Ganta already was. Homura already was. But I hadn't been born with anything. Every point of it I'd dragged out of the dirt with my own 2 hands and my own patient, ruthless, borrowed mind, and there was no ceiling anywhere above me, and I had just learned the most important lesson of the whole long climb. I didn't have to be stronger than the monster. I only had to be smarter about where it stood when it died. The boar quota came due the autumn I was 10, and it nearly killed my father. Every village in the barony owed tribute, and ours owed boars. Not the lean forest pigs a man could take with a spear and a dog tuskers. The oversized breed that lived in the deep wood beyond the ridge, half again the size of an ox, with tusks like plow blades and a temper to match. The Baron's table wanted them, and the Baron's steward wanted 8 of them dressed and delivered before the first frost, and it did not matter to the steward that a full-grown tusker had killed a village man every 2nd or 3rd year for as long as anyone could remember. 8 boars, 6 men fit enough to hunt. I did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was ugly, and I'd been doing ugly arithmetic long enough to know when it was going to cost blood. I couldn't go. That was the wound of it. I was 10, small for 10. And officially the talentless, useless boy, a child with no business on a tusker hunt, whose presence would only be one more body to guard. My father went in my place, the way he went to everything in my place, coughing in the cold morning, his crooked finger curled around the same spear that had killed a rookhawk he still didn't fully understand. They brought him back on a sledge 2 days later. A tusker had come out of a thicket where they hadn't expected one, and my father had done what a serf does when the quota is short and the frost is coming. He'd stood in its path instead of running to turn it toward the other men's spears, and a tusk had opened his thigh and cracked the bone beneath, and he'd bled into the leaf litter until they got a tourniquet on him. They had 6 boars. They'd lost a 7th in the chaos. And they'd very nearly lost my father, who now lay on our straw with his leg splinted and packed and his face the color of tallow, sweating a fever that meant the wound had gone bad. My mother did everything right. Boiled water, clean cloths, the bitter yarrow poultice old Sina swore by. It slowed the fever. It didn't break it. And I sat by my father in the dark and listened to him breathe wrong and did the coldest, hardest math of my life. We had 6 boars. We owed 8. We were 2 boars short and 1 hunter down, and the frost was a week off, and a short quota meant the steward would take the difference in coin we didn't have, or in the last of our stock, or in a man for the road work gangs, and my father could not walk, let alone work a road. The machinery of the world had my whole family in its teeth and was closing slowly, and no amount of hiding in the grass was going to stop it. So I stopped hiding. I told my parents the truth that night, both of them. I decided it lying there watching my father sweat, because the mask had a cost I'd stopped counting, and the cost had just come due in his blood. I can help, I said, with the boars. I've been able to help for a long time. And when my mother started to say something soft and dismissing, the thing you say to a child who wants to be useful, I did the thing I had never once done in front of another human being. I summoned a dog. It came out of the light onto the packed dirt floor of our hut, gray and lean and real, and sat and looked at me for orders. My mother made a sound and pressed both hands to her mouth. My father, fever and all, went very still, and his eyes tracked from the dog to me and back, and I watched him arrive, slowly, at the question he'd set down and refused to ask the morning after the bird died. "That's how you killed it," he said. His voice was a scrape. "The rook. It was you." "It was me," I said. "The stone couldn't read it, Father, because it isn't anything the priests have a name for. It's mine. It only works for me and only I can see it, and if anyone knows a priest, a lord, anyone, they'll take me, or take it, or decide the talentless boy who commands beasts is a witch thing and burn the whole family for hiding him. So I hid it. I've been hiding it your whole life to keep it safe." I dismissed the dog. It burst into motes. My mother flinched. "I hid it from you too. I'm sorry I couldn't put it on you to keep. But I can't hide it while you die of a boar quota. So I'm telling you, and I'm going to fix the quota. And I need you to help me hide it after." Silence, in the little hut, with the fire low and my father's breath rasping. My mother was the one who moved first. She crossed the floor on her knees and took my face in both her rough, thin hands and looked at me not at a witch thing, not at a stain, not at a monster. She looked at her son, hard, the way she'd looked at me in the crib in a life she'd never know I remembered, and she said, "You've been alone with this since you were small." It wasn't a question. I didn't answer it. My throat wouldn't work. "You listen to me," she said. "You are my boy. Whatever's in you, it came out of you, and you're mine, and there's nothing." Her voice cracked and she pushed through it. "There's nothing the priest could read or not read that changes that 1 inch. You hear me? We keep your secret. Not because it's shameful, because it's ours." She looked over her shoulder at my father. "It tetsu." My father reached out his good hand, the one with the crooked finger, and I put mine in it, and his grip was weak with fever, but it closed like a man closing on the last rung of a ladder. "All these years," he said, "I broke my back for a boy the world called worthless." His cracked mouth pulled into something that wasn't quite a smile and was somehow more than one. "And it turns out I was raising the strongest thing in the valley, and he was too clever to let anybody know, so nobody'd take him from me." His eyes were wet. Fever, maybe. "You did right, son. You did right to hide, and you'll do right now. Fix the quota and come home." That was the first time in 10 years the Surf family that took me in dared to hope, and it wasn't hope for a good glyph or a lucky turn. It was hope in me. I've built a great deal of my life on strange foundations, but I built more on that night than on any level I ever gained. Now the practical part, because grief doesn't fill a quota and love doesn't drag a boar out of the deep wood. I couldn't hunt tuskers like the men did, corner them, spear them, and hope. 6 grown men had done that and lost a boar in nearly a life. I was 10, but I didn't have to hunt like a man. I had 5 years of running summons, and one enormous advantage the whole village lacked. I knew exactly how a tusker's mind worked, because I'd hunted them in the old life, and I knew the 2 things that killed hunters were the ambush and the charge, and both of those were sight problems. A tusker has bad eyes and a magnificent nose. It hunts and fights by smell and sound, which meant a tusker didn't need to be fought. It needed to be driven, pushed, spooked, herded along a path it chose itself because it thought the path was its own idea, straight to a place I picked, where the killing could be done by a spear it never saw coming. I built the drive over 2 days with the 4 men still fit enough to walk. I told them a version they could hold, that I'd found sign of a good run through the ridge draw, that if we spooked the boars from the far thickets, they'd funnel down the draw's only clear path, that we could take them one at a time at the narrow neck where the ground pinched between 2 rock shoulders. It was all true. I just left out how I knew and how the boars were going to be spooked, and by what, because the drivers were mine. I ran a pack of dogs through the far thickets on the wind side, where a tusker's great nose would catch dog scent and move, away from the threat, down the only easy ground, the draw. I didn't send the dogs to fight. A dog that closes with a tusker is a dead dog and a wasted summon, and I'd learned to hate waste. I sent them to be a smell and a noise in the wrong place, a pressure the boar relieved by walking exactly where I wanted. And I rode the edge of it the way I'd learned to ride a summoned senses over the last year, not fully, not yet, but enough to feel where the dogs were and where the boars broke, enough to steer the whole invisible machine from a rock above the neck of the draw where I crouched, useless looking, keeping out of the way. The first tusker came down the draw an hour after dawn, exactly on the line, huffing and irritated and thinking about the dog smell behind it and nothing about the men ahead. At the neck, the two best hunters took it from the sides, from cover into the shoulder and the throat, the way you can only take a boar that doesn't know you're there. It was over in seconds. No charge, no blood but the boars. We did it 4 more times over 2 days. The men thought it was the terrain and my sign. They thought the draw was a gift of luck, that the boars were running stupid this year. And I let them think it, because a village that believes it got lucky sleeps fine, and a village that starts wondering how the talentless boy always seems to be near when the impossible happens does not. By the second dusk, we had 5 fresh tuskers dressed on the sledges beside the 6 from the first hunt, 11 boars against a quota of 8, 11, 3 over. I did that on purpose, and I want you to understand why, because it's the same reason I chose Abyss and the same reason I'll choose it again at the end of everything. A quota exactly met earns you nothing. It's the number the world already decided you owed. 3 boars over the number that's a surplus, and surplus is the only lever a serf ever gets to pull. Surplus is trade goods. Surplus is a story the steward carries back up the hill about a village that over-delivered in a hard season. Surplus is the first pebble of leverage in a life that had never owned a single one. I wasn't just filling a quota, I was starting a business. My father lived. The fever broke on the 3rd night, the way fevers do when the wound's been kept clean and the body's got any fight in it, and my father had spent 40 years finding fight in a body the barony wore down to nothing, so he found some more. He'd limp for the rest of his life. The bone knit crooked, like his finger. One more thing the world had healed wrong on him because no one who could set it properly would waste the effort on a serf. But he lived, and he sat up on the straw a week later and watched me count boar trophies into piles for trade, and he watched me do it with the cold, quick certainty of a man 3 times my age, and he didn't ask a single question. He just watched his son and let himself hope. "You know what the steward's going to say," he told me one evening, while I sorted tusks by size. 11 boars, a village that lost a man to the wood and still overpaid its due. He's going to ask how. "Let him ask," I said. "The answer is the draw ran good this year and the men hunted clever. That's all true." My father snorted, which turned into a cough, which he waved off. "You've got an answer for everything, little liar." He said liar the way another father might say scholar. Then he was quiet a while, turning a small tusk over in his crooked hands, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone somewhere serious. "Suda, that thing you do. The dogs, the bugs, the all of it." He set the tusk down. "How far does it go?" I thought about the interface glowing where only I could see it. Level 8 and no ceiling anywhere above it, a road running up out of the dirt farther than either of us could imagine. "I don't know yet," I said, and it was the truest thing I'd told anyone in 2 lifetimes. That's the part I like. He looked at me a long moment, my broken-backed father who'd bled into the leaf litter to turn a boar off the other men, and something settled in his face, not understanding. He never fully understood what I was, but trust, which is better and rarer. He nodded, the same single nod Homura had given me over a dead bird. "Then find out," he said. "Just come home when you do." 11 boars went up the hill to the Baron's table. 3 over quota, in a season that killed a man and crippled another. The steward wrote it in his ledger, and carried the story of it back to a lord who noticed, distantly, the way lords notice, that one backwater village had overpaid its due in a bad year, and made a note of the name. I didn't know it then, kneeling in the mud sorting tusks, but that note was the first thread of the whole rope I'd climb out of serfdom on. My father's blood bought a quota. My mind bought a surplus. And a surplus, in a world of castes and quotas and men who wrote things in ledgers, was a door with the smallest crack of light showing under it. I put my hand against that door, 10 years old, and started, patiently, to work it open. I turned hunting into a machine, and the machine bought my family out of serfdom. It took 2 years, and I want to walk you through the economy of it, because the numbers are the whole point. A serf doesn't own his surplus. The Lord owns the man and the man's labor and everything the labor makes. But there's a crack in every wall, and the crack in this one was merit. A serf could be raised to free commoner by a lord's word, usually for something a lord valued: a soldier's service, a rescued heir, a debt bought back in coin. Coin was the slow door, but it was the door that didn't require anyone dying, so I chose coin. Here's how a business runs when your entire workforce is invisible and never sleeps. The village owed boars and got boars every season over quota, delivered clean. That was the base. But an overfilled quota left surplus animals. The boars past 8. The extra deer and forest pig my drives turned up as a side effect, and surplus animals meant hides, tusks, dried meat, rendered fat, and sinew, all of it tradable at the market town 2 days down the valley road. A serf can't leave his land to trade. But a serf's lord takes a cut of anything traded in his name, so the steward was happy to license our village's surplus to a traveling factor for a share, and our share of the share came home as copper. Copper is slow, so I made the copper faster. I stopped hunting only for the quota, and started hunting for value density. The same instinct that had ranked grasshoppers against frogs against dogs, applied to a whole forest. A boar was a lot of meat for a lot of risk and weight. But the deep wood held rarer things. Musk glands from the ridge foxes that the town's perfumers paid silver for, the venom sacs of the marsh vipers that the apothecary bought by weight, the horns of a certain mountain buck that ground down into medicine for a lord's gout. None of those were things a normal serf could reliably find or safely take. All of them were things my scouts could find and my summons could take, and none of them weighed more than a boy could carry home in a sack under a load of firewood. The village never knew the half of what I brought in. I let the boar surplus be the visible story and moved the silver quietly through my father, who, free of the wound fever, limping but shrewd, turned out to have a talent for haggling with factors that no Templestone had ever bothered to read. He'd sit with a traveling trader and dicker over fox musk with the patience of a man who'd bled for everything he owned, and he'd come home with coin, and he'd count it into a jar buried under our floor, and neither of us ever said aloud what the jar was for. We both knew what the jar was for. By the time I was 12, the jar was heavy enough. My father took it to the steward himself on his crooked leg and laid out the price of manumission for a family of 5: himself, my mother, me, and my 2 younger siblings born in the years between, plus the customary gift a serf makes to grease a lord's goodwill. And here the note in the ledger paid off, the one the steward had made about a village that overpaid in a bad season because the Baron remembered us. A village that overdelivers is a village worth keeping happy, and a serf who buys his own freedom with honest coin in a world where most die owing more than they own is a curiosity a bored lord finds pleasing. Baron Kuroda granted it, my father's merit. The overfilled quotas, the freedom price paid in full, the boar hunt where he'd stood in a tusker's path to save the other men, all of it went in the ledger as cause, and the family that the Templestone had branded with a talentless son walked out of serfdom as free commoners. I stood in the yard with my mother the day the steward's man read it out, and I watched my father hear the word free said about himself for the first time in his life, and I watched him not know what to do with his face. My mother knew. She put her arm around his crooked back and held him up the way she'd held him up through the fever, and my younger brother and sister ran in circles not understanding, and I stood a little apart and did the cold private arithmetic of a job completed on schedule and under budget, and then I stopped doing arithmetic and let myself just watch my father be free, because some numbers you're allowed to stop counting. For a week we were free commoners in our own hut, and it was the best week of that life, and I should have known the Baron would find a way to bill me for it. The bill came in the shape of his daughter. Baron Kuroda, in his gratitude and his lordly obliviousness, decided the freed family's clever boy, the one the steward mentioned had a knack with the hunts, would make a fine personal attendant for his daughter, Lady Rin, who had just turned 11 and needed servants of good character to fill out her household. He did not ask. Lords don't ask. He assigned me to her service as a condition of his own goodwill, not gifted like a serf, exactly. A free commoner can't be handed over like a plow, but placed, made to understand that a wise family accepts a lord's favor in the shape the lord chooses to give it. A free commoner's family does not refuse a baron's favor, because the freedom we just bought was a document the baron could make trouble for at any hour of any day, and everyone in that yard understood the arithmetic perfectly. So 2 years of silver and blood bought my family out of one man's ownership and placed me, personally, into another's household. I swallowed it. I want to be honest that swallowing it was hard. Harder than the fever nights and the 5-year grind, because there is a specific taste to injustice served with a smile, to being thanked into a smaller cage. But I'd learned to eat things that tasted like that a long time ago, and I ran the new arithmetic before I'd finished bowing. An attendant in the Baron's manor. Fed. Housed in the manor. closer to the market town, closer to the deep wood on the manor's own hunting preserve. And this was the part the Baron would never have understood. A servant's duties filled the day, which I had never much needed, and left me the night, which was where I lived anyway. My grind had always run in the dark. The manor just gave the dark better real estate. I said goodbye to my family across a 2-day valley I'd walk back whenever I could, and I went up the hill to serve Lady Reincarnated, and I met for the first time the small imperious tyrant who would one day walk away from a palace to explore the wild lands at my side. On that first day I would not have believed you if you'd told me, and neither would she. Lady Rin was insufferable. I mean this precisely, and with a kind of retroactive fondness. She was 11, sharp-tongued, spoiled in the exact way a baron's only daughter gets spoiled, everything given, nothing earned, no talent yet unfolded, but the certainty of one coming, because girls of her blood were always something at the stone. She looked at the new servant, the freed serf's boy with the blank temple record, and she decided within an afternoon that I was beneath contempt and above suspicion, which is precisely the impression I cultivated in everyone, and precisely why she was so useful to be near. "You're the talentless one," she said, the first time she deigned to address me directly, holding out a cup for me to fill without looking at me. The stone read nothing. "Father says you're clever with animals. Are you clever, or are you a witch?" "Clever, my lady," I said, filling the cup. "Witches get burned. I intend to be useful." She actually laughed at that, a surprised, undignified laugh she immediately smothered, because ladies did not laugh at servants. Jokes. And then she looked at me with the first flicker of the thing that would eventually become respect and was, on that first day, mere curiosity that a serving boy had a mouth on him. "You're impertinent." "I'm useful, my lady. The impertinence is included at no extra charge." She threw a cushion at me. I let it hit me. It's important, when you're secretly the strongest thing in a barony, to be very good at getting hit by cushions. That became the shape of my days, fetching, carrying, standing behind chairs, being ordered about by an 11-year-old with the emotional regulation of a wet cat, and enduring it with the bland patience of a man who has decided the cushion is not worth a war. She was lonely. Under the tyranny I could see it even then, the specific loneliness of a child raised as an asset rather than a daughter, surrounded by servants who feared her, and tutors who flattered her, and a father who loved her in the distant transactional way of nobility. But I filed that under later, the way I filed everything, and I served, and I waited for the sun to go down, because at night, I built. The manor slept early and slept hard, and a servant boy who slipped out to check the snares. On the Baron's preserve raised no eyebrows, and past the preserve was deeper wood than my village had ever held, thick with things worth killing. I ran my grind harder than I ever had, because the manor fed me real food, meat, bread, enough of it that for the first time in that life, my body wasn't a starved little engine running on scraps, and a fed body holds more mana and recovers it faster. My reservoir swelled. My levels climbed off the floor at last, out of the single digits, up into numbers that would have meant something to another player, and I poured every point into the systems that made me dangerous. The card upgrades came first. I'd found them at level 10. The interface let me fuse summons, feed a dozen weak grasshoppers into a single stronger one, or fuse 2 dogs into a beast that was more than the sum of them, spending mana and experience to trade quantity for quality. I ran the fusion math for weeks and found the sweet spots, the summons worth upgrading and the ones better left cheap and disposable. The inventory skill came next, and it changed my whole logistics, a pocket of space I could store things in, hides and trophies and tools. So I stopped carrying firewood over sacks of contraband and started walking home empty-handed with a fortune in a fold of nowhere. Silver moved faster after that. The jar under my parents' floor got a companion. And then came the thing that mattered most. The thing I'd been reaching toward for years and finally seized in full at the manor. I learned to swap. Not just write a summon senses, I'd been doing that in pieces since I was 8, feeling where the dogs were, steering the board drives from a rock. This was more. I learned to put my consciousness into a summon, fully, to leave my own body sitting safe and slack in the dark and become the dog, become the bird overhead, see through its eyes and move through its limbs while my true self lay a mile away untouched. A hawk summon on the wing, scouting the whole preserve in a wide, silent circle. A field mouse in a wall, listening to conversations in rooms I'd never be allowed to enter. I could be anywhere the smallest, most unnoticed thing could go, which in a world of casts and closed doors is the single most valuable place to be. I tested it the night I first got it clean. I put myself into a sparrow and flew it up over the manor in the moonlight and looked down at the whole barony spread out silver and small, the manor, the preserve, the road to the market town, the far valley where my family slept free in a hut I'd bought with fox musk and boar tusk and patience. And I sat in that sparrow's little pounding heart, 12 years old, a servant by day, and something the world had no name for by night, and I looked down at the cage I'd been placed into and felt, for the first time, that it wasn't a cage at all. It was a base of operations. Below me, in the dark, a spoiled little tyrant slept in a manor she thought she owned, in a barony her father thought he governed, in a world that had read my soul and written nothing, and none of them had the faintest idea that the useful, impertinent, talentless boy who filled the cups and caught the cushions was, quietly and coldly and entirely on schedule, becoming the most dangerous thing for 100 miles. I flew the sparrow one more slow circle, memorizing the map of everything I intended to use, and then I let it dismiss and banked the last thread of experience and climbed back into my own body in the dark to sleep a few hours before Lady Rin needed her morning cup. There was work to do. There was always work to do. I couldn't wait to get to it. The goblins started raiding the barony the summer I was 13, and by autumn I'd wiped out 4 warrens, and no one knew it was me. I found the first warren by accident, scouting through a hawk one night the way I did every night now. Goblins are the bottom rung of every monster ladder, small, cowardly, individually pathetic, and catastrophic in numbers because they breed like rats and raid like locusts. A single goblin is a joke. A warren of 200 is a burned village and a season of starvation, and the barony had warrens breeding in the hills the way an untreated wound breeds rot. The knights knew about them, distantly. A warren was a job for a war party, a dozen armed men, a fortnight in the field, real risk and real cost, and Baron Kuroda's little barony had exactly 1 understrength company of knights under Captain Bando and a great many more pressing bills. So the warrens grew and raided, and the barony bled slowly, and everyone treated it as weather. I treated it as experience. Because here's the thing about a goblin warren from the perspective of a summoner who never sleeps. It's a bank. 200 low creatures, each worth a trickle of experience, packed in one place, guarded by nothing that could threaten a well-run swarm. In the old life, I'd have cleared it with a party in an afternoon. Now I cleared it alone, in the dark, and let the barony wake to find a den of raiders mysteriously slaughtered, and thank whatever god they liked. The tactics were the fun part. You don't fight 200 goblins. You harvest them, and you do it the way you'd run any factory line for throughput, with minimum losses, on a repeatable process. My process went like this. First, reconnaissance, which I now had in a form no army in this world possessed. I'd swap into a hawk and map the warren from above by day, every entrance, every sentry post, the water source, the paths the raiding bands took out and back. Then I'd swap into something small at night, a rat, a beetle, and send it into the warren, through a side tunnel, and walk it through the whole underground layout while my body sat safe a mile off in the dark. I knew a goblin warren's floor plan better than the goblins did before I ever spent a point of mana on an attack. No general in the Alliance had that. I had it every single night for free. Second, the kill box. A warren has a main entrance and a few bolt holes. Goblins, panicked, do one thing reliably. They flee the noise toward the light, out the main mouth, in a stampede. So I'd summon a plug of heavy beasts, my fused dogs, the ones I'd upgraded into something closer to dire wolves, and set them at the bolt holes, not to fight the horde but to seal it, to turn every escape into a dead end, so the whole warren funneled out the one mouth I chose. Third, the swarm at the mouth. That's where the killing happened. Goblins boiling out of a single tunnel into a churning wall of my summons, packed too tight to fight, too panicked to organize, dying in the exact bottleneck I'd built for them. I ran the gnat swarm trick I'd killed the rook with, scaled up clouds of biting insects to blind and choke, so the goblins couldn't even see what was killing them, and behind the blindness, the wolves and the fused beasts did the work. I lost summons, of course. Goblins are weak but not harmless, and 200 of anything can drag down a wolf. But a dismiss before death summon cost me nothing but the mana to recast, and a dead goblin pays experience whether my summon survives or not, so the math ran in my favor as long as I kept throughput high and never let the swarm break. I treated it like a spreadsheet with teeth, and I got very, very good at it. By the 4th warren, I could clear 200 goblins in under an hour and walk home with my body's boots still clean, and the barony had started noticing that its goblin problem was solving itself. "It's the wolves," Captain Bando said. I was standing behind Lady Rin's chair at her father's table, being furniture, the way a good servant is furniture, and the Baron had Bando in for a report on the raiding, and I got to listen to the whole barony try to explain me and get it wrong. Bando was the knight captain, a big weathered man in his 40s, gray coming into his beard, the kind of soldier who'd risen on service instead of blood and had the scars to prove he'd earned every rung. He was frowning over a report he plainly didn't believe. 3 warrens in the eastern hills, my lord, wiped to the last goblin, torn apart. My scouts say it's a wolf pack gone unnaturally large and bold. The tracks are strange. He didn't like the word strange. I could hear it. Bando was a man who liked explanations that held together. There's no natural pack that clears a warren, my lord. Wolves eat what they can catch and leave the rest. These left nothing alive and ate almost nothing. That's not hunting. That's... He trailed off, because the word that fit was war, and wolves don't wage it. Whatever it is, Baron Kuroda said, comfortable and uninterested, it's doing my work for me and costing me nothing. Let it. Post a bounty on the goblins we can prove and let the strange wolves have the rest. He waved a hand. The gods are generous this season. You're welcome, I thought, refilling Lady Rin's cup with a face like a wall. Bando didn't let it go. That's the thing about honorable men who like their explanations to hold. They don't stop pulling the thread just because their lord stopped caring. I watched him decide, right there at the table, that he was going to find out what was clearing his warrens, and I filed him under careful, 1 notch above later. Rin, meanwhile, had noticed nothing except that her cup was full and her afternoon was boring, which was exactly how I liked her. I was also, that autumn, getting reminded that not everyone had forgotten the talentless boy. I walked back to my old village whenever Rin's household could spare me, to see my family, to move silver, to sit an evening with my father and let him beat me at the strategy game he'd carved from boar bone, which he did honestly, and which I let him do because a man who bled for you deserves to win at something. And on one of those walks on the Market Town Road, I ran into Ganta. He was 15 now, the blacksmith's son, and his axeman talent had unfolded into exactly what the stone promised: a young man built like a door, strong past any ordinary strength, apprenticed to his father's forge, and already better with an axe in a fight than most grown men. He'd left the village for the town, chasing the future a real talent buys, and he'd grown into his loudness rather than out of it. Well, he said, planting himself in the road with 2 town boys at his back, the same formation he'd used at 4. If it isn't the Baron's little cup boy, heard they made you a servant, suits you. Talentless, then a serf, now a serf who fetches drinks, he grinned at his friends. You've really climbed in the world, haven't you, all the way up to holding a lady's teacup, the town boys laughed. Ganta soaked it up, and under the swagger I could see the same scared kid from the grass, clinging to the one good thing the world had handed him, needing to be loud about it because deep down he still wasn't sure it was enough. I could have said a great many things. I was, at that point, strong enough to have my summons take Ganta and his friends apart before they finished laughing, and there was a small mean part of me, the part that had eaten cushions and injustice and the taste of being thanked into a cage that wanted to. I ate that too. It suits me fine, Ganta, I said, and stepped around him and kept walking. Give my regards to your father's forge. It does good work. He shouted something after me, some jab about running away, and I let him have it, because a man who's genuinely strong doesn't need the road to know it, and because I'd already learned the most valuable thing about Ganta. He was loud and cruel in the small way of the frightened, but he wasn't rotten. Rotten was Viscount Sakaki, whom I hadn't met yet and would come to hate properly. Ganta was just a kid who'd peeked at the temple stone and was terrified it was all downhill. I filed him where I'd always filed him, later. But I moved him, that day on the road, from later, an enemy to later, a project, because I'd started to think the barony was going to need every real talent it had before the end, and an axeman who could be turned from a bully into a comrade was worth more to me than an axeman I humiliated in a road. I just didn't intend to be the one holding the teacup when I turned him. The shadow work was reshaping the whole barony by then, and it was strange to watch from behind Rin's chair. Fewer raids. A goblin problem that had bled the eastern villages for years simply stopping. Roads safer, harvests coming in whole, the little grim arithmetic of a poor barony tilting quietly toward survival. The Baron credited the gods and his own excellent governance. The villages credited the strange wolves and lucky knights. Bando credited nothing yet because Bando was still pulling his thread. And nobody, not one soul in the whole barony, credited the servant boy who filled the cups. I sat with that some nights, up in a hawk over the sleeping hills, and I won't pretend there wasn't an itch to it, the itch of every unseen worker who watches someone else get thanked for the labor. But the itch was the price of the mask, and the mask was the price of survival, and I'd been paying that price since before I could walk. A serf's child who reveals he commands an army doesn't get gratitude. He gets owned by a lord or a temple or a war machine, the way the barony owned Ganta's future and my father's back. I'd bought my family out of one man's ownership. I was not going to sell myself into a bigger man's. So I did the work in the dark and let the world thank the gods, and I banked the experience, and I climbed. I was clearing the fourth warren the night it changed, the night the shadow work started building toward something I couldn't clear in an hour. I'd sent a beetle deep into the warren to map it before the kill, and I walked it through tunnel after tunnel, and the warren just kept going, bigger than any I'd hit, and the goblins in it weren't just goblins. There were bigger shapes among them, hobgoblins, the officer cast. And deeper still, in a chamber my beetle crept to the edge of, a shape that made my little borrowed heart lurch even through a beetle's dull eyes. Orcs. Not goblins pretending to be threats. Orcs the real thing, tall as men and stronger, with iron in their fists instead of scavenged bone, and the goblins around them weren't a warren at all. They were a host, and the orcs were organizing them, the way a warband organizes rabble, and I'd stumbled through my beetle onto the front edge of something the barony's one understrength company of knights could not stop. I pulled the beetle out slow and careful and let it dismiss, and I climbed back into my own body in the dark hills, and I lay there doing very fast, very cold arithmetic. The goblin raids hadn't been the problem, the goblin raids had been the symptom. Something was gathering the small monsters of the hills into an army, and armies have generals, and this one's general was going to come down out of the hills onto a village that couldn't stop it, and the only creature in the whole barony who knew it was coming was a 13-year-old servant who wasn't allowed to speak at his own lord's table. I looked up at the stars over the hills where the host was breeding, and I started, right there, to build the plan. I was going to need a much bigger swarm. I had days maybe, not weeks. I'd learned enough about how monster hosts gather to know the tempo. A warband doesn't sit, it grows until it can't feed itself off the hills, and then it moves, because a host of thousands eats a countryside bear in a season, and the orcs driving it know it. The goblins I'd been quietly farming all autumn hadn't been random raids at all. They'd been the host's foragers, ranging out from the deep warren to strip the barony's edges, and I'd been culling them one den at a time without ever seeing the shape behind them. I'd been trimming the fingers and missing the fist, so the first thing I did before any plan was go count the fist properly. I couldn't do it with one beetle. A beetle sees a chamber. I needed the whole host mapped, its size, its bolt holes, the ground it would march over, and I needed it in a night, because every night I spent counting was a night the host grew. So I did something I'd never tried at scale. I split my attention across a relay of summons. A hawk high up for the wide picture, and below it a chain of small things, rats, beetles, a burrowing mole I'd unlocked in the spring that I swapped between one after another, each one moving while the last held position, walking my consciousness through the warren like a man crossing a river on stones. It was exhausting in a way pure levels don't fix. Riding one summon is a held breath. Riding a relay for hours is holding your breath and passing it hand to hand, and my real body lay slack in the cold hillside the whole time, and I had to trust the dark to keep it while I was gone. By the gray edge of dawn I had the count, and the count was worse than the beetle had promised. The deep warren held better than 1,000 goblins and hobgoblins. Threaded through them, giving them shape, were perhaps 200 orcs, and the orcs answered to a chamber at the warren's heart that my mole crept close enough to smell, and in that chamber was a thing that made even a mole's dull nerves crawl. Bigger than the other orcs by half, older. Its tusks capped in beaten iron, a crude standard of skulls planted beside it, and around it a bodyguard of the largest orcs in the host standing in something that was almost discipline. An orc king, or the start of one, a warlord strong enough to bend 1,000 small monsters into a single-edged thing and point it downhill. I pulled the mole out, let it dismiss, and climbed home into my own cold body, and I lay in the frost with the sky going pale and did the arithmetic I'd been avoiding since the beetle. I could not clear this the way I cleared the warrens. A kill box at the mouth works on panic, and orcs don't panic the way goblins do. The orcs would hold the bolt holes, break my plugs, and turn my funnel into a fighting retreat that ground my swarm down faster than it ground them. 1,000-strong host with a warlord and 200 real fighters was not a bank to be harvested in an hour. It was a battle, and I was 13, and I was alone. Which meant I had two choices, and I hated both. The first was to tell someone. Walk up to Captain Bando or the Baron and say, there is an orc king massing 1,000 monsters in the eastern hills, and it will march within the week. And then answer the only question that mattered: how do you know, Cupboy? With either a lie no scout could confirm in time, or a truth that ended with me owned or burned. Bando was already pulling the thread on his strange wolves. Handing him the whole tapestry would unravel everything I'd spent 13 years hiding. The second choice was to stop it myself, alone, in the dark, the way I'd stopped everything else, and to do it against an army with a body that still filled a lady's teacup by day. I lay there and let myself feel the size of it, honestly, because pretending a thing is small is how you die to it. Then I did what I always did. I stopped feeling the size of it and started taking it apart into pieces small enough to solve. Piece 1. I didn't have to beat the host, I had to beat the king. A warband is a spine pull the warlord out of it, and the 1,000 small monsters holding together out of fear come apart into the panicking rabble I knew exactly how to harvest. Kill the king, and the battle I couldn't win became 4 warrens I could. Piece 2. I couldn't kill the king in his chamber, surrounded by his best, on ground he owned. I had to make him come to me, onto ground I owned, the way I'd made the Tuskers walk down the draw thinking it was their own idea. A warlord marching a host downhill picks the easy road, because a host is slow and hungry and follows the path of least resistance the same as a boar. I knew the ground between the deep warren and the nearest village better than any map I'd been flying it nightly for a year. Somewhere on that road was a place I could turn 1,000 monsters into a funnel and a warlord into a target. Piece 3, and the one that kept me awake past dawn. I was going to need more summons than I had ever fielded at once, upgraded harder than I'd ever pushed them, and I was going to need to command them across a battlefield the size of a valley while also being everywhere at once through the relay, and I was going to need to do all of it in a single night, because a host on the march doesn't wait for a boy to rest between rounds. I sat up in the frost as the sun came over the hills, 12 hours from having to stand behind Rin's chair and pour her morning cup like nothing in the world was wrong, and I started, coldly and carefully, to build the biggest thing I had ever built. First, the army. I had the experience banked from a full autumn of warrens more than I'd ever sat on, because I'd been farming faster than I'd been spending. I poured it into fusion, all of it, running the sweet spot math I'd worked out on scraps of my mind over months. Not a horde of cheap disposables this time. The King's Guard would chew cheap summons like bread. I needed a core of upgraded beasts that could stand against orcs long enough to matter, wrapped in the cheap swarm that did the blinding and the funneling. Quality at the center, quantity at the edges. I fused wolves into things closer to bears, upgraded my hawks into raptors that could actually strike, and left the gnat clouds cheap because their whole job was to be a wall you couldn't see through. Second, the ground. Between the deep warren and the village lay a place I'd flown 100 times without ever seeing its use until now, a stretch where the easy road ran through a narrows between a steep scree slope and a marsh, a bottleneck a host would pour into because the alternatives were a climb or a bog. If I could bait the king onto that road and close both ends, I could stack 1,000 monsters into a space where their numbers stopped mattering and turn the whole edge of that scree slope into a killing ground the orcs couldn't spread out to escape. Third, the bait. A warlord marches toward the easiest prize. So I'd give him one a village worth taking, undefended, right down the easy road, exactly where I wanted him to hurry. I'd have to move the actual villagers first, quietly, without explaining, which was its own puzzle. But a host that thinks it's about to fall on soft prey moves fast and moves loose, strung out on the march, king and guard well forward and eager, which was precisely how I wanted the spine when I broke it. I had the shape of it by the time the manor stirred. It was thin in a dozen places and any of them could get me killed, and I had perhaps 3 nights to make it real, 3 nights of my mole teams and mud summons doing earthwork no living animal could match, because a dozen moles working parallel through the dark did in one night what a crew of diggers would sweat a week over. I had to do all of it while smiling and pouring and catching cushions and being furniture, because the one thing more dangerous than an orc king was anyone in that manor wondering why the cup boy hadn't slept. I washed the frost off my face in the trough, put on the bland, useful mask I'd worn since before I could walk, and went up the hill to fill Lady Rin's morning cup with my hands perfectly steady, doing the arithmetic of a war behind a servant's eyes. The gods, the Baron liked to say, were generous this season. The gods had nothing to do with it, and they never had, and in 3 nights I was going to prove it in a narrows full of dead orcs that no one would ever know I'd killed. The village on the easy road held 40 people, and I had to empty it without telling a soul why. That was the first move, and the hardest, because it required a lie big enough to move 40 people and small enough that no one carried it up to Bando. I solved it the way I solved everything obliquely. I couldn't say an orc host marches on you. So through a hawk I found a real hazard on the ridge above their water source, a stretch of scree that had genuinely started to slip, and I made it slip more, working a summoned mole through the soil at its root over 2 nights until a section came down across their spring in a slide that fouled the water and threatened the huts. A village whose only water goes bad and whose ridge is sliding onto the huts themselves does not need to be told twice to move to kin down the valley for a season, and there was no other spring near, no easy well to fall back on, and the next slide looked ready to take the homes. Over the next several days, grumbling about their luck, They went 40 souls walking away from a killing ground they'd never know they'd stood on. I felt the weight of the deception and I carried it, because the alternative was 40 funerals and a truth that ended in my own, and a man who's bought his family out of one cage learns to choose which lies he can live with. Empty village. Bait set. Now the king. I sprang the host on the third night, and I did it by feeding the warlord exactly the story he wanted. A host on the edge of moving needs a reason to commit, to strip forward off its warren and march. So I gave the Orc King a scout's report he could believe. I swapped into a goblin I could ride my own summoned goblins now, and I summoned one at the warren's far edge and sent it running and wide-eyed and screaming the way a real forager would, and I made it carry the one thing a warlord can't ignore: news of soft prey, undefended, a village of 40 down the easy road with its warriors gone and its stores full. The king took the bait the way the tusker took the draw because it was already the thing he wanted, and I'd just made it his own idea. Within the hour the warren was moving. I watched it from a hawk, a black river pouring out of the hills and down onto the easy road, king and iron-tusked guard well forward and eager, the 1,000-strong rabble strung out loose and hungry behind, exactly as I'd needed the spine to be. It marched straight into the Narrows was mine. 3 nights I'd worked it, and I could only work it that fast because my diggers weren't men. A dozen moles working parallel through the dark did in one night what a crew of laborers would sweat a week over, because a summoned mole never tires and never rests, and I could field a whole shift of them at once and steer everyone. 3 nights of that, and the scree slope on the north side was loosened at a dozen points the way I'd loosened the village's ridge, the marsh on the south seated with my summons waiting in the mud, the mouth behind them a place I could plug and the mouth ahead a place I could close. I let the whole host pour in. I let the king and his guard get well forward, 3/4 of the way through, before I closed the door behind them. The door was a wolf pack, my biggest fused beasts, 20 of them, dropped across the rear mouth of the Narrows in a wall of teeth, not to kill the tail. To seal it, to turn the loose marching column into a thing that couldn't retreat, so the whole host was committed inside my ground with no way back the way it came. Then I brought the slope down. Every loosened point on the scree, all at once moles at the root of each, dismissing themselves in a cascade I'd rehearsed in my head 100 times, and the north wall of the Narrows came down onto the packed column in a roar of rock and dust. It didn't kill most of them, it didn't have to. It broke them into pieces, cut the host into segments that couldn't reach each other, buried the middle, and turned one army into a dozen isolated knots of monsters choking on dust and screaming in the dark, exactly the panicking rabble I knew how to harvest. The gnat clouds went up next into the dust so no orc in the Narrows could see 10 feet, and into the blindness I sent the swarm. I fought that battle from 4 bodies at once, and it nearly broke my mind. My real body lay hidden on a shelf above the marsh, slack and vulnerable, and I'd never in my life left it for as long as I was about to. So I did the only thing I could to guard it. I chose a shelf with a single narrow approach, and left a pair of cheap summoned dogs dozing at my side, the only insurance I could afford, because every point of mana spent guarding my body was a point I couldn't spend on the war below. Then I rode the relay harder than I'd ever ridden anything, a hawk for the whole picture, a lead wolf at the front of the swarm to command the killing, a beetle near the king to track him through the dust, my own eyes snapping back to my slack body every few minutes to make sure nothing crept up on it in the dark. 4 points of view, passed hand to hand, for the better part of an hour, while a valley full of monsters died in pieces below me. The rabble broke exactly as designed. Goblins and hobgoblins, cut off from the spine, buried and blinded and stampeded, boiling in panic into the swarm and dying in knots the way they'd died in 4 warrens all autumn. That part was arithmetic I'd already solved. The experience poured in so fast the interface stopped announcing it 1 kill at a time because a host this size, threaded with orcs, paid on the threat curve, and even ground down by the penalty 1,000 real monsters was worth a mountain I couldn't have farmed out of the grass in a decade. The king was the problem I hadn't solved. He didn't panic. That's what makes a warlord. The world comes down around him, and he plants his iron-tusked feet and organizes. Through the beetle I watched him gather his guard out of the dust and chaos, 20 of the largest orcs in the host, and instead of dying like his rabble he hacked a corridor through my swarm with brute-ordered fury, his guard around him in a wedge, driving toward the marsh mouth ahead where the Narrows opened and he could break into the open and escape to breed the whole thing again. I couldn't let him reach open ground. In the Narrows, my traps and terrain made me the equal of a warband. In the open, a warlord and 20 guard orcs would scatter my swarm and butcher my fused beasts by main strength, because in a straight fight, I was still a 13-year-old with borrowed soldiers, and the whole reason for the Narrows was that I could not win the straight fight. So I broke the plan and improvised, which is the part of battle no spreadsheet survives. I pulled my entire surviving core, the wolf bears, the raptors, everything upgraded I had left off the dying rabble, and threw all of it at the king's wedge at the marsh mouth, and I stopped harvesting and started fighting, spending summons like water. It cost me. Orc guards tore my fused beasts apart 2 and 3 at a time, and every one that died was experience and mana I'd never get back, and for a few red minutes in the dust I honestly did not know if I was going to win. The king was a wall of iron and muscle carving toward open ground, and I was throwing everything I owned into his path, and it was barely holding. I won it with the marsh. The king's wedge, driving for the open, had to cross the seam where the road met the bog, and I'd seeded that seam 3 nights running, and it was mine down to the mud. As the guard hit it, I sprang the last thing I'd held in reserve. Not beasts, but the ground itself. My summons in the mud, dismissing all at once in a churn that turned firm footing to sucking bog under a wedge of heavily armored orcs at a dead charge. The guard went down. Not killed, mired, stuck to the knees in muck at the exact instant their momentum meant everything. An armored charge turned into a bog full of floundering targets. And the king, for 1 second, was alone and stuck and blind in the dust with his guard floundering around him. 1 second was all I'd built the whole night to buy. I brought down everything I had left on that single point, every surviving beast, the raptors from above, the wolf bears from the flanks, the swarm reforming out of the dust, all of it onto one mired warlord in 1 heartbeat, the way I'd learned to strike a rook hawk's throat when it couldn't see me coming. He killed 4 of my summons even mired, even swarmed. He was magnificent, honestly, in the way a thing you have to destroy sometimes is. And then the weight of it was too much even for him, and the iron-tusked king of the eastern hills went down into the bog under a mountain of my creatures and did not come up. The interface went white. I don't have the number for you clean, because it came too fast to count level after level, a full Autumn's Warrens and a 1,000-strong host and an orc king all landing at once, the biggest single night of experience in 13 years of climbing, because a warlord is the richest single kill a summoner can make, and the threat curve pays it whole, even after the penalty grinds it down. I sat on my shelf above the marsh in 3 collapsing bodies and my own reeling one, and I watched the number climb, and I let the swarm finish the leaderless rabble the easy way while I just breathed. I'd killed an army, alone, at 13, and no one would ever know. I nearly didn't make it home. That's the part the spreadsheets never warn you about. I'd ridden 4 bodies for the better part of 2 hours, spent nearly every point of mana I owned, and left my real self slack and starving on a cold shelf all night. And when I finally pulled fully back into my own skin, the price came due all at once. My head split with the worst pain of that life. My nose bled, my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and my body, a 13-year-old's body that had eaten nothing in 18 hours and fought a war through proxies all night, simply gave out. I'd overspent the vessel the way I used to overspend that first single point of mana, and the vessel billed me for it. I lay on the shelf and made myself do the survival arithmetic through the pain, because a summoner who conquers an army and then dies of cold and hunger on a hillside has optimized nothing. I had whey bread and water in my inventory. I'd learned my lesson years ago and never went into the field without them. I ate, I drank. I dragged my ruined body into a cleft out of the wind, kept the 2 dogs dozing at the approach a while longer for the little warmth and warning they gave, and let my body shake, and I did not try to summon so much as a grasshopper. And slowly, over the gray hours before dawn, the shaking eased and the headache dulled to something I could walk on. I was late back to the manor by 3 hours, and I told them I'd been caught out by a slide on the preserve road, which was almost true, and no one questioned the exhausted cup boy because no one ever imagined the cup boy had anything to be exhausted about. I found the mithril chasing the last of them. Because the improvised finish at the marsh had let a knot of orcs slip out the ahead mouth in the chaos, a dozen, no more, fleeing leaderless into the hills, and I don't leave loose ends. So 2 nights later, recovered, I ran them down through a hawk and followed them to ground in a cavern in the deep hills, and I sent a beetle in after them to map the kill before I spent a single summon. The cavern didn't hold 12 orcs, it held a queen. An armored ant the size of a plow ox, pale and blind and vast, in a nest of drone workers, and the fleeing orcs had blundered into her territory and been torn apart by the drones before I ever arrived, nature solving my loose end for me. But the queen was a monster in her own right, a real one, and I filed her under dangerous later. Because it was the thing beneath her that stopped my breath. The ants had been mining. That's what those armored ants do. They eat their way through stone for the minerals in it, and the walls of the queen's chamber, where the drones had chewed the rock away, ran with a vein of dull silver-blue metal that even through a beetle's poor eyes, I recognized from 1,000 hours of the old life. Mithril, not a trace. a vein a seam of it running back into the dark farther than my beetle could follow. The single most valuable metal in the world, the stuff of the finest blades and the rarest armor, the kind of find that lifts a dying backwater barony into wealth in a generation. Baron Kuroda's little domain scraped by on boars and copper and bad harvests, one poor season from ruin. And I just found, guarded by a monster queen in a cavern no one knew existed, a fortune that could remake the whole barony's future. I pulled the beetle out and let it dismiss and sat in the dark with the two biggest facts of my 13 years side by side. I'd killed an army and told no one. Now I'd found a fortune, and I was going to have to find a way to hand it to my lord to give a dying barony the mine that saved it while still standing behind Lady Rin's chair as the talentless cup boy the stone read nothing. I'd need Bando for that, I realized. The honorable captain still pulling his thread about the strange wolves. Sooner or later that thread was going to reach my hand, and when it did, I'd have a choice to make about who in this world got to know what I really was. But that was a problem for a night I wasn't this tired. I banked the last of the experience, memorized the way to the mine, and turned my aching body back toward the manor and the morning cup, carrying an orc king's death and a barony's fortune behind a servant's blank and useful face. Captain Bando caught me summoning on a Tuesday, and I let him. I want to be precise about that, because it matters. Bando had been pulling his thread for a season, the strange wolves, the warrens that cleared themselves, the orc host that never came down out of the hills the way his scouts swore it was forming. He was a good enough soldier to know that luck doesn't run one direction for that long, and a stubborn enough man to keep walking the eastern hills on his own time looking for the thing that was doing his work for him. Sooner or later he was going to be standing in the wrong place at the right moment, so I chose the moment for him. I had a problem that no amount of hiding could solve, a mithril vein guarded by a monster queen in a cavern nobody knew existed, and a barony one bad harvest from ruin that desperately needed it. A servant cannot find a mine. A servant cannot kill an ant queen. A servant cannot walk up to his lord and say, "I have made you rich." But a servant could be discovered carefully, by the one man in the barony honorable enough to protect the secret instead of selling it, and let that man carry the fortune up the hill in a shape the world would accept. I'd watched Bando for a season the way I watched everything. I knew his patrol routes, his habits, the nights he walked the hills alone. And when I finally decided to clear the ant queen because that mine was worth more than my hiding, and because a queen breeding in the deep hills was its own slow disaster, I did it on a night I knew Captain Bando would be close enough to hear a war. He found me at the cavern mouth with an army at my back. I didn't fight the queen the way I'd fought the king. A queen is a fortress, not a warlord, slow, armored, blind, but vast, and surrounded by drones that repair and defend her by instinct. You don't break her spine because she doesn't have one. You starve her position, seal the drones off from her in waves, blind her with swarm, and grind the great pale bulk of her down under sustained weight while your fused beasts trade with the drones at the edges. It was long, ugly work, and it was loud, and I was 3 summons deep in it, a wolf bear at the queen's flank, a raptor diving her eyes, my own body standing exposed at the cavern mouth, directing the whole thing aloud because I'd stopped bothering to hide when there was no one for a mile to hear, when there was someone for a mile to hear. I felt him before I saw him, through the hawk I'd left circling out of pure habit. A big man on the ridge above the cavern, stopped dead, staring down at a 13-year-old servant standing calm at the mouth of a monster's lair, while an army of impossible beasts tore a queen apart in the dark below him. Captain Bando had found his strange wolves. I could have run. I could have dismissed everything, played the terrified boy who'd stumbled onto a battle, spun some lie. I'd built the whole life on lies like that. Instead, I finished killing the queen. I let him watch me do it. I let the honorable captain of the barony stand on that ridge and see the full shape of the thing his thread had led him to the swarm. The fused beasts, the raptors, the boy commanding all of it aloud with the flat competence of a veteran general, the pale mountain of the queen going down at last under a weight of creatures that came from nowhere and, when it was over and I let them, vanished into nothing. Then I turned and looked up at him, and I said, into the ringing quiet, "You've been looking for me for a season, Captain. Come down. There's something in this cavern you'll want your lord to know about." Bando came down the ridge with his hand on his sword and his face doing a great many things at once. Up close, he was bigger than he looked at the Baron's table, gray-bearded and scarred, and his eyes went from me to the churned battleground to the spot where the queen had been and back to me, again and again, trying to fit a talentless cup boy into a thing that had just killed a monster his whole company couldn't have. "The stone read nothing," he said finally. Not a question. His voice was rough. "At the temple, they wrote you talentless. I heard it from the steward myself." He stopped a spear's length from me, and I watched him decide whether I was a boy or a witch thing, the same decision my mother had made on a dirt floor 3 years before. "What are you, boy?" "Talentless," I said, "is exactly right. The stone couldn't read what's in me because it isn't anything the priests have a name for. It's a summoner's gift, Captain. I call beasts, I command them, I see through their eyes. It works only for me and only I can see it, and if a priest or a greedy lord ever learns of it, I'm owned or I'm burned, and my family with me." I held his eyes. "I've been hiding it my whole life. I've been clearing your warrens all autumn. The orc host you kept looking for and never found it marched 2 weeks ago, 1,000 strong under a king, and it died in the narrows east of here, and I'm the only reason a village of 40 didn't burn. I let that land. I'm not telling you this because you caught me. I'm telling you because you're the only man in this barony I'd trust with it, and because there's a mithril vein in that cavern that can save your lord's domain, and I need an honest man to carry it up the hill in a shape the world will believe." Silence, in the deep hills, with the queen's blood cooling between us. I'd bet everything on my read of the man. If I'd read him wrong, if Bando was the kind who ran straight to a priest, or straight to a lord who'd cage me, or who saw a weapon to be owned instead of a person to be shielded, then I'd just handed my life to the wrong hands, and I'd have to disappear that night and never come back to a barony where my family lived. Bando took a long breath. He looked at the cavern. He looked at the boy who'd bled for his barony in the dark all autumn and asked for nothing, not even the credit. And the honor that had carried him up from common blood on service instead of pedigree turned slowly from suspicion into something harder and better. "A summoner," he said. "The old class. The despised one." He shook his head. "My grandfather told stories about them. Beast callers who broke sieges before the temples decided the gift was low and stopped reading it into the stones." He looked at me with something I hadn't earned from any adult in that world but my parents. "You've been carrying this whole barony on your back since you were a child, alone. And you let the Baron thank the gods for it. Gratitude's dangerous when you can't afford questions," I said. His mouth twisted. "Well? You've got an honest man now, boy. God help us both." He put his hand out not to draw, to clasp, and I took it, and the knight captain of the barony became, that night at a dead queen's side, the first shield I'd ever had who wasn't blood. "Show me your mine. And then you and I are going to figure out how to make Baron Kuroda rich without either of us telling him a single thing that gets you burned." We told the Baron a version that held. Bando carried it, because a knight captain reporting a mithril strike is believed and a servant claiming one is flogged. The story we built was mostly true, filed of its dangerous edges. Bando, investigating the cleared warrens, had followed Sign to a cavern in the deep hills, fought through an ant queen's nest with, he allowed, unusual help he preferred not to detail before witnesses, and found a mithril vein that could remake the barony. He asked to speak to his lord alone. And in that private room, with the door shut, Captain Bando told Baron Kuroda the truth about his daughter's cupboy, because a fortune that size could not be built on a lie the lord didn't know he was standing on. I was in the room. I'd asked to be. If the Baron was going to learn what I was, I wanted to watch his face while he learned it, and be ready to run if his face was the wrong one. Baron Kuroda heard it all: the summoner's gift, the warrens, the orc king, the mine, and his face did the thing I'd braced for and hoped against. I watched the merchant behind the noble wake up. I watched him look at the talentless servant boy and see, for one naked instant, not a person but an asset, a weapon, a mine, a fortune walking around in a serf's skin. It was the exact look I'd spent 13 years hiding from. And it was the reason I'd made sure Bando was in the room, because I needed a witness to what happened next. "My lord," Bando said, before the Baron could speak, in the flat, hard voice of a man laying his career on a table. "This boy freed his family with honest coin. He cleared your hills asking nothing. He found your mine and could have sold it to Sakaki or the temple for a wagon of gold and vanished, and instead he brought it to you through me. He is not a thing you own. He is a free commoner who has chosen so far to serve you." Bando let that sit. "If word of what he is leaves this room to a priest, to a rival, to anyone he has taken from you, and this barony gets nothing. His secret is the mine. Bury one, you bury the other. I watched the Baron do the arithmetic." He was pragmatic, Kuroda not cruel, just a lord, seeing the world in ledgers the way I saw it in numbers. And the ledger Bando had just laid out was unanswerable. A caged summoner runs, dies, or is stolen. A protected one, freely serving, makes you rich and safe for a generation. Gratitude was cheaper than greed, and Baron Kuroda, whatever else he was, could read a column. The asset look faded. Something more careful replaced it. You could have taken my mine and my measure both, and left, the Baron said slowly, to me, directly, for the first time in the 2 years I'd poured his daughter's cups. Why didn't you? Because my family lives in your barony, my lord, I said. And because a summoner alone is a hunted thing, but a summoner with a lord's shield is just a lucky barony's good fortune. I don't need a throne. I need not to be owned. Keep my secret, and you have the richest domain in the province and a summoner who will defend it. Break it, and you have a wagon of gold once and a burned boy forever. I bowed, properly, the servant's bow, and looked up. I'm offering you the good trade, my lord. I'd take it. Baron Kuroda looked at me a long moment. Then he laughed the same startled, undignified laugh his daughter had given me on my first day, and I understood suddenly where Rin got it, and he said, God's teeth. Bando, the boy negotiates like a guild factor. He shook his head. Done. Your secret for my shield. And the mine builds this barony, and you'll have from me what a summoner's worth, which is a great deal more than a cup. He leaned forward. But you'll keep pouring my daughter's tea a while yet, boy, because a barony that suddenly elevates its servant invites exactly the questions we're burying. You stay hidden. You stay useful, and you and Bando keep this domain safe. Agreed? Agreed, my lord, I said, and meant it, and walked out of that room with the second shield of my life and the whole shape of my future quietly rearranged. The quiet stretch that followed was the first rest I'd had in 13 years, and I didn't know what to do with it. The mine changed everything, slowly and then all at once. Baron Kuroda worked it carefully. A strike that size, announced too loud, draws wolves, and the biggest wolf in the province was a viscount named Sakaki, who I'd start hearing about that season and come to hate properly the next. So the Baron mined it quiet and traded it careful, and the Copper and Boar's barony began quietly to have real coin, and roads got mended and stores got filled and the whole domain exhaled for the first time in a generation. And I, for the first time since a crib, had people who knew. That's a thing I hadn't reckoned, the weight of how heavy it is to be the only one who knows what you are, and how much lighter it gets when you're not. Bando took to walking the hills with me on my clearances, not fighting, just there, an honest man at my back who I didn't have to lie to. My family knew, the Baron knew. It was a small circle, and it was the first circle I'd ever stood inside instead of outside, and I found myself, that quiet season, letting the mask slip a little more each week among the few who'd earned the truth. Rin was the one who caught me off guard. She was 13 now too, and the tyranny had started to wear thin at the edges, and one evening she found me on the manor's back step in a rare idle hour, looking out at the hills, and instead of ordering me to fetch something, she just sat down beside me, a lady, on a step, beside a servant, which no one had taught her to do, and was quiet for a while. Father's different lately, she said finally. The barony's rich all of a sudden. Everyone says it's the mine Captain Bando found. She glanced at me sidelong, sharp under the spoiled, sharper than I'd let myself notice. But you go into the hills with Bando at night, and you come back tired. And father looks at you like you matter now, and he never used to look at you at all. She wasn't accusing. She was lonely and reaching, the way a girl raised as an asset reaches. You're not just a cup boy, are you? I looked at her, the imperious little tyrant who'd thrown a cushion at me 2 years ago, and under her, for the first time clearly, the child no one had ever sat on a step beside. I filed a great many things about Rin Kuroda that evening under a heading I'd been leaving empty. Not later. Something warmer. I'm useful, my lady, I said. I told you that on the first day. You did. A small, unwilling smile. The impertinence at no extra charge. We sat on the step and watched the hills go dark. A lady and her servant, and neither of us quite either. And for one quiet evening in a hard life, nobody needed anything from anyone, and it was enough. I didn't know it was the last quiet season I'd get for years. I didn't know that up the province the Baron's heir was riding to a front that would kill him, or that a viscount named Sakaki was already turning covetous eyes toward a certain mithril mine, or that the whole gentle machinery of my hidden, comfortable climbing life was about to come apart on the deck of an airship. I just sat on the step in the dark beside a girl who'd finally seen me, banked the strange new lightness of being known, and let myself, for once, not do the arithmetic. The news of Aoi came up the valley on a gray morning, and it broke the barony's heart before it made mine cold. Aoi was the Baron's heir, Rin's older brother, 18, gone 2 years to the front the way every noble child in the Alliance went, because that was the law of a world at eternal war. They called it the noble's duty. A pretty phrase for the machinery that took half the young of every noble house and fed them to the Dark Lord's hordes so that commoners would follow lords who bled the same as they did. Aoi had been dutiful. Aoi had been brave. Aoi had held a wall in some mountain fortress 100 leagues away and died holding it, and a courier brought a folded letter and a sword and a lord's condolence up the valley to a father who'd sent his son to die because a 100-year war required it. I'd never met Aoi. He'd been gone before I came to the manor. But I watched Baron Kuroda read that letter, and I watched the pragmatic merchant lord who'd negotiated with me like a guild factor become, in one breath, an old man who'd outlived his boy, and I understood for the first time the full cruelty of the world I'd been quietly getting rich inside. The mine, the shields, my careful climb, none of it had mattered to the machine that took Aoi. The war didn't care that the barony was suddenly wealthy. It cared that the barony owed it children, and it had come to collect. Rin didn't cry where anyone could see. That was the training. She held herself together through the whole terrible day of it, the lady's composure over a 13-year-old's shattered heart, and it was worse than tears. I found her that night on the back step where we'd watched the hills go dark, and I didn't say anything useful because there isn't anything useful, and I just sat down beside her the way she'd once sat beside me, a servant on a step beside his grieving lady, and let her not be composed for a while in the dark where only I could see. "He used to call me a brat," she said at some point, very quietly. He was right. A long breath. The war just takes them, that's all. That's the whole rule. You're born a noble, so you go, and the war takes you, and nobody even fights it, they just fold the letter and send the sword home. Her voice cracked on something too big for 13. What's the point of any of it? The mine. Being rich. He's still... She didn't finish. I didn't make her. I filed something that night that I'd carry to the end of everything, not under later, under the reason. Because I'd been climbing for myself and my family, coldly, on schedule, and I'd never once looked up at the machine that ate Aoi and thought someone should break that. Sitting on the step beside Rin, I looked up at it. Sakaki moved on the third day of mourning, because a viscount who scents weakness moves during a funeral. I only understood the shape of it afterward, but here it is whole. Viscount Sakaki was the province's rising wolf, an oily, lawful, ruthless man who'd wanted the mithril mine since word of it first leaked, no matter how careful the baron traded. A mine that rich, in a mere baron's hands, was a thing a viscount considered misfiled. And a barony reeling from a dead heir, its lord gutted with grief, was a barony ripe to be leaned on. Sakaki's play was elegant and vicious. Take Rin the baron's only remaining child and ransom her not for coin but for rights to the mine, dressed up in enough law and hired distance that his own hands stayed clean. He did it during the morning, when the manor's guard was thin and grief slack, and no one was watching the roads. Rin was to travel to a kinswoman's estate to grieve away from the barony, a normal thing, a sad thing, arranged quietly. Sakaki's people simply intercepted the small mourning party on the road, killed 2 guards, and spirited Rin onto an airship bound out of the province, guarded by a hired professional named Shindo, who did the kind of work viscounts don't ask about. I was not in the mourning party. I was a servant. Servants don't travel with a lady's grief. I found out the way I found out everything through a bird. I'd taken to flying a hawk over Rin's road out of pure, unadmitted worry, because I'd sat on a step beside her twice now, and the second heading in my ledger wasn't later anymore, and it was the hawk that saw the ambush. 2 guards down in the road, Rin dragged, struggling toward a moored airship in a hidden meadow, a lean gray man directing it with the calm of a professional. And the airship's lines already casting off. I didn't send for Bando first. There wasn't time, and by the time I'd have reached him, the ship would be a speck. I did the arithmetic in one cold second, the same arithmetic I'd done my whole life. What can I reach and what can I do with it? And the answer was terrible, and it was the only answer. The airship. I had to be on the airship, and I had to get there through the air. I'd raised the thing 3 days after I killed the Ant Queen, and I'd never told anyone it existed, and I'd hoped never to need it. Not the Dragon Guardian that was years and thousands of magic stones away, a secret masterwork I'd only just begun to grow. This was something else, something I'd fled from for 3 straight days when I was small and green, and it had hunted me across the eastern hills. A griffin worm, the barony's old terror, a flying predator I'd survived as a child only by hiding and running until it lost interest. I'd gone back for it 2 years later, when I was strong enough, not to kill it but to break it, to wear it down over a season of night ambushes, chip its strength through summons, until I could add its card to my roster as the largest flying summon I owned. I'd never fielded it. It cost a fortune in mana, and I'd had no cause to fly. I had cause now. I summoned it in the manor yard in broad daylight, which ended my careful hiding in the span of 1 heartbeat, and I did not care. The great winged thing burst into being over the cobbles, servants screaming, and I was on its back and climbing before the first of them found their voice, because a girl who'd sat beside me on a step was on an airship pulling away over the province, and I had exactly one way to reach her. The chase was the most reckless flying of that life. The airship had a head start and a wind, and my griffin worm was fast but tiring under a summons mana drain that ran down my reservoir like water through a fist, and I flew it flat out across a province I could see spread below me, closing, the ship growing from a speck to a hull to a thing with people on its deck, and one of the people looked up and saw a boy on a monster coming out of the sun, and I watched Shindo, the professional, do the thing professionals do when the impossible arrives. He stopped being surprised in under a second and started preparing to kill it. I put the griffin worm onto the airship's deck in a crash of wings and splintering rail, and I was off its back before it had fully landed, and I dismissed it the instant my feet hit the boards to reclaim what mana I could, because I was going to need every point of it, and a flying summon burns them just staying aloft. And then it was me, on a pitching deck 1,000 feet up, against Shindo. "The talentless servant boy," Shindo said. He'd been briefed. Of course he had. Sakaki's people had watched the manor. He knew there was a clever cup boy the Baron had grown fond of, a freed serf the Templestone had read as nothing, and he looked at me with the flat contempt of a man who'd been sent to guard against knights and found a child. He had a girl to deliver and a mine to secure, and here was a nobody who'd arrived, admittedly, on a monster, but the monster was gone, and what stood on his deck now was a 14-year-old servant with no sword and no talent the holy stones could read. "You flew a beast up here to die," he said, drawing a pair of long fighting knives with the unhurried economy of a man who'd killed with them many times. "I'll make it quick. Sit down, boy. The lady comes with me." Behind him, bound to the mast, Rin was staring at me like I was a ghost. "Suda," she started, and Shindo didn't so much as glance at her, which told me everything about how little he rated the situation. I want to describe what happened next honestly, because it was the first time I fought a real, trained, dangerous human, and it was not like fighting monsters, and I nearly got it wrong. Shindo was fast, faster than the Orc King, in the way a scalpel is faster than an axe, precise, economical, every motion a killing motion. He came at me across the pitching deck expecting to end a child, and if I'd been the child the stone described he'd have ended me in 2 seconds. But I'd spent 14 years becoming a general who fights through others, and the one thing a general must never do is fight the enemy's fight. So I didn't fight his. I filled the deck with my swarm not to kill him, a professional cuts through gnats, but to blind, the oldest trick I owned, a churning cloud between us that took his eyes for the half-second I needed. And into that half-second I put not a beast but a wall of them, my fused wolf bears summoned in a ring around him all at once, too many to cut through, hemming a scalpel into a space where precision meant nothing. Shindo killed 2 before he'd finished turning, he was that good. And it didn't matter, because I wasn't trying to kill him with the beasts either. The beasts were the funnel, same as the narrows, same as the draw. Same as everything I'd ever done, herd the deadly thing into the one place I chose and strike it where it can't strike back. I drove him with the wall toward the shattered rail where my griffin worm had come through, toward the open 1,000-foot drop, and Shindo, a professional, reading the ground, seeing the trap did the only smart thing, and disengaged from the beasts to reset, which put his back to the gap I'd steered him toward. And in the instant he committed to that reset, I swapped. I'd summoned one thing small and unnoticed at the start, in the chaos of the crash a hawk, up in the rigging, that he'd never marked as a threat among the wall of wolf bears. And I'd been in my own body the whole fight, so the swap cost me a stagger of disorientation I couldn't afford, but I took the hawk's eyes for 1 second, saw the whole deck from above, saw exactly where Shindo's weight was, and where his back was open, and where my beast stood, and snapped back into my body with the picture burned in. Then I moved my whole wall at once, from a position I could only have judged from above, and shoved a scalpel off his feet at the exact moment the deck pitched, and Shindo, who had scorned the talentless servant boy, who had drawn his knives without hurry, went backward through the shattered rail with a wolf bear's shoulder in his chest, and caught the broken rail with one hand at the last instant, dangling over 1,000 feet of open sky. His knives gone, his contempt gone, his whole professional certainty replaced by the plain animal horror of a man who has just discovered that the child was never the child at all. "What are you?" he got out. "Useful," I said, and I did not let him fall, because a corpse tells no Viscount anything, and a captive tells a court everything. I had a wolf bear haul him back onto the deck and pin him there, disarmed and shaking, and I went and cut Rin free of the mast with my own shaking hands. She grabbed me. Not the lady, the girl, the one from the step, both arms around me on a pitching deck 1,000 feet up, and she was crying now where anyone could see, and I let her, and I held on too, because my hands wouldn't have stopped shaking either way. "You came," she said into my shoulder, furious and broken and 13. You flew a monster. You're not a cup boy, you were never a cup boy, I'm useful. I said again, and it came out wrecked, and she laughed the startled, undignified Kuroda laugh through her tears. And for a second on that awful deck, we were just two kids who'd found each other alive. Bando arrived on a Barony Griffin as the airship limped back toward the province. He'd had the Hawk's warning. After all, I'd sent a second bird for him the instant I was airborne, and the honest captain had commandeered a war griffin and flown after me, and he reached the ship in time to do the one thing I couldn't: make it legal. A servant defeating a hired killer is a scandal a Viscount can bury. A knight captain of the barony, arriving to find the Lady Rin kidnapped and her captor bound with a confession to be wrung out of him, is a case that stands up in a lord's court. We had Shindo. Shindo, faced with the drop he'd dangled over and the choice between Sakaki's silence and his own neck, talked professionals always talk, their loyalty being a fee and not a faith, and named the Viscount, and the whole clean lawful conspiracy came apart because Sakaki had made the one mistake his kind always makes. He'd assumed the talentless servant was a nobody, and built his crime on that assumption, and the nobody had come out of the sun on a monster. Bando looked at the churned deck, the dead assassin's blades, the shattered rail, the boy standing in the middle of it holding his lord's weeping daughter. You revealed yourself, he said quietly, not an accusation, a soldier noting the cost. The whole manor saw a monster take you off the yard. That secret's spent, lad. I know, I said, and I did. 14 years of hiding ended in one heartbeat over a girl on a step. I found I couldn't be sorry. Some things are worth more than the mask, Captain. Bando looked at Rin, wrapped around a servant she'd never let go of the same way again, and at the bound Viscount's man who'd learned too late what he'd underestimated, and the old knight's scarred face did something almost like a smile. He said, I suppose they are. We flew the ship home. Sakaki's crime went to a lord's court that a barony grown suddenly rich and suddenly wronged could actually fight. And the talentless cup boy who'd come out of the sun stopped being a secret and started, whether I'd chosen it or not, becoming something the province was going to have to reckon with. The mask was gone. I'd worn it since a crib, and I'd shed it for a girl, and standing on that deck with the wind coming back into my lungs, I found I didn't want it back. It was time to stop hiding and start climbing where the world could see. Sakaki fell in a lord's court, and I finally learned the whole shape of the world I'd been climbing inside. The court took a season. Shindo's confession, Bando's testimony, the dead guards on the road, the airship's log, it stacked into a case even a Viscount couldn't bury, especially once Baron Kuroda, grief turned to cold purpose, spent mine coin like water to make sure the right lords heard it. Viscount Sakaki was ruined, stripped of rank, lands forfeit, his oily lawfulness undone by the one variable he never priced, the talentless servant. I didn't gloat. I filed him closed and turned to the thing his fall had opened, which was a full accounting of the world from a man whose job was to give it. The Baron brought in an instructor, a scholar officer from the academy, sent to assess the province's gifted youth for the war, and I sat in on the briefing as an honored guest, which is what I'd become, and for the first time someone laid the whole board out plain. 100 years of war, the Dark Lord in the north, and beneath him an archdemon named Raziel, who commanded the hordes that ground against the Alliance's fortresses without end. 3 peoples clinging together against it, humans, dwarves, elves, and Alliance fraying at every seam of old grievance, held only by the shared fact that apart they'd each be devoured. One official hero, a 5-star talent named Raidzen, on whom the hopes of a continent hung like a coat on a single nail. And the noble's duty, the machinery that had taken Iowi every noble house feeding its children to the front, so the commoners would bleed beside masters who bled the same. 100 years of the young of a whole civilization poured into a wall against the dark. Half, the instructor said plainly, when the Baron's face asked the question aloud. Roughly half the noble youth who go to the front do not come home. It has been so for a century. It is the price of the Alliance holding it all. I sat with that. Half. Awai had been a coin flip that came up wrong, and there was nothing exceptional about it, and there would be another Awai in every noble house every year until the war ended or the Alliance died. I'd looked up at that machine on a back step beside a grieving girl and thought someone should break that. Sitting in the briefing, I stopped thinking someone and started, quietly, doing the arithmetic of what it would actually take. It would take ending the war. It would take killing Raziel. And Raziel was a thing that a 5-star hero and the massed armies of 3 peoples had failed to reach in 100 years, which meant it was, for now, a problem too large to solve, which is exactly the kind of problem I'd spent my whole life reducing to pieces small enough to take one at a time. I filed Kill Raziel under the reason, the same heading as Aoi in the back step, and I did not tell anyone I'd filed it, because a 14-year-old announcing he'll end a century of war gets laughed at or burned, and I'd learned long ago to keep the good things secret until I was too strong for anyone to take them. The Baron freed my family of everything, and it was the closest I ever saw him come to grace. Kuroda had been raised on my council through the whole Sakaki affair. The mine wealth handled shrewdly. The enemy's fall turned to the barony's rise, and the province's lords, weighing a domain grown rich and a viscount's forfeit lands going spare, elevated Baron Kuroda to Viscount Kuroda in Sakaki's place. He knew exactly who'd built that. And a lord who'd once looked at me with the asset hunger and then chosen the better trade came, over that season, all the way around to something like gratitude. He freed my family of all dues, forever, not just the manumission I'd bought with fox musk and boar tusk, but a full release. My father and mother and siblings raised as high as a commoner family could go without a title, their little valley hut become a holding they owned outright. He did the same for Homura's family, unasked, when I mentioned her, because Homura's swordsman talent had unfolded into something the province was starting to talk about, and a wise lord invests in the gifted. And to me, personally, he offered a servant's release, and whatever a summoner was worth, which by then he understood was a very great deal. You could have a captaincy, he said, in the same room where he'd once weighed owning me. Land when there's land to give. Name your price, summoner. You've earned it thrice over. I thought about it honestly. A comfortable life was on the table for the first time ever. Safety, wealth, a title in a barony grown rich, my family free and prospering, a girl on a back step who'd stopped being a lady around me. I could stop. I'd climbed out of the dirt the stone had buried me in, and I could set the pack down and live. And Aoi was still dead, and half the noble youth of a continent were still going to die next year, and the machine that ate them was still turning, and I'd filed break that under the reason and meant it. I'll stay an honored guest, my lord, I said. Not a servant, not a captain, free. And I'll ask you for one thing instead of land. I looked at him. A recommendation to the academy. I want to enter as a fighter for the war. Kuroda stared at me like I'd lost my mind, which was fair. You have everything, he said. You've won. And you want to walk into the machine that killed my son. Because it killed your son, I said. And it'll kill 1,000 more like him every year until someone reaches the thing at the top of it. I've spent my whole life making problems too big to solve into pieces small enough to take. I held his gaze. This is just a bigger problem. I'd like to start reducing it. He was quiet a long time. Then, slowly, the Viscount who'd buried an heir nodded, and I saw in his face that some part of him had needed one person, just one, to look at the machine that took Aoi and refuse to fold the letter and send the sword home. Then you'll have your recommendation, he said. God help the archdemon. I hadn't expected the others to come with me. I certainly hadn't planned Ganta. Rin decided first, and she decided it at me rather than to me, the way Rin decided everything. If you're going to the academy, I'm going, she informed me on the back step, arms crossed, chin set. Her mage talent had finally unfolded that season, a strong one, the gods. Gift for magic waking in her the way they said it would, and she'd thrown herself into it with a fury I recognized, because a girl whose brother the war had taken did not intend to be composed about it anymore. Father wants me safe in court. I've been safe. Safe is where they put you, until the war remembers your family owes it a body. I'd rather learn to fight the thing than wait for it to fold my letter. Her voice didn't crack this time. She'd grown past that. And someone has to keep you from flying a monster into a wall. Clearly. It's dangerous, my lady, I said. The academy trains for the front. Half don't. I know exactly what half means, she said, and there was Aoi in it, and I stopped arguing, because she was right, and she'd earned the choice, and because the second heading in my ledger had her name at the top of it, and I didn't want to walk into the machine without her at my side any more than she wanted to wait behind for it to come. Homura came the way weather comes. She'd grown into her prodigy's talent, a swordswoman the province sent for now, 16 and already better than grown knights, fierce and loyal, and still, under it, insecure in the exact way 5-star raw talent makes a person insecure, because talent handed to you can always be surpassed by someone who earned theirs. And Homura had spent her whole life half afraid she was only good, because the gods decided it, and not because she'd bled for it. She found me the week the recommendations came through, planted her sword point down the way she had over a dead rook hawk, and said, "You're going to the academy. You're going to become something enormous, and I'm going to hear about it secondhand, and I hate that." "So come," I said. "Obviously I'm coming," she said, as if I were slow. "But you still owe me a real duel." No hiding, no summons, no level handicap, you and me in swords, when we're both grown and neither of us is holding anything back. You promised me that over a dead bird when we were 9. She jabbed a finger at me. The academy's where you stop hiding, so the academy's where I finally get to beat you. You can try, I said, and she grinned, savage and delighted, and I understood that Homura had spent 7 years quietly terrified I'd leave her behind in the grass, and that the academy meant she never would. And then there was Ganta. I found him at his father's forge in the market town, and he was 19 now, a smith in his own right and a fighter grown into real skill, and everyone had heard that the talentless cup boy he'd mocked in the road was the one who'd come out of the sun on a monster and saved the Viscount's daughter and toppled Sakaki. He'd heard the truth about the summoner. And Ganta, the loud-scared boy who'd peeked at the temple stone and dreaded it was all downhill, stood in his forge and looked at the person he'd bullied since they were 4, and I watched him do the hardest arithmetic a proud man ever does. You were the strongest one the whole time, he said. Not a jeer, flat and a little sick with it. I called you useless, in the grass, on the road, all of it, and you were the strongest person in the valley and you just took it. He set down the hammer. Why'd you take it? You could have buried me any day for 10 years. Because you weren't rotten, Ganta, I said. Just scared. And I don't waste good material. I looked at the forge, at the honest work of it, at the axeman's talent that was real and earned in its own way. I'm going to the academy to fight the war. I'm going to need people who can actually hold a line while I do the clever part. You're loud and you're stubborn and you swing an axe like the gods meant it, and I'd rather have you at my flank than anywhere else. So stop apologizing and come be useful. Ganta stared at me. Then he laughed a big, wrecked, relieved laugh, the laugh of a man handed a second chance he knew he didn't deserve, and he stuck out his enormous smith's hand, and I took it, and the bully from the grass became the last piece of the thing we were about to build. The hardcores? He said later, when the 4 of us stood together for the first time in the academy's Shadow Me the Summoner, Rin the Mage, Homura the Sword, Ganta the Axe. He said it grinning, half a joke. That's us. We're doing the hardest thing, aren't we? The war. Raziel, all of it. Everybody else is trying to survive the academy and we're planning to win the war. He shook his head. Hardcore. The hardcores. I looked at the 3 of them, the mage who'd chosen the machine over safety, the swordswoman who'd never let me leave her behind, the smith who'd turned from a doubter into a comrade, and I thought about a boy in a crib doing grim arithmetic over the worst possible start, choosing the hardest setting on purpose because the reward was never the peak. It was the slope. The hardcores, I agreed. The academy loomed the week after, and I knew exactly how deadly the path I'd chosen was, and I chose it anyway, and I made sure the others chose it with their eyes open too. I sat them all down before we went. Rin, Homura, Ganta, and I told them the truth I hadn't told anyone but a Viscount in a private room. Not the whole truth about my nature, even now I held the deepest cards close, but the truth about the odds. The academy trained for the front, and the front was the machine that ate Ioi. And half the noble youth who walked into it did not walk out, and no talent, however bright, changed that arithmetic by itself. Homura's genius wouldn't save her from a horde. Ganta's strength wouldn't. Rin's magic wouldn't. The war didn't lose to talent. It lost to numbers, and to the archdemon that fed the numbers, and I was walking us all toward it on purpose. I'm telling you this, I said, because I chose the hardest road once when I could have had an easy one, and I don't regret it, but I chose it for me. This time I'm choosing it and dragging you 3 with me, and that's not the same. So I need you to choose it clear-eyed. Half don't come back. That's real. If any of you want the comfortable life, take it now, and I'll love you for it and go alone. Rin didn't blink. Aoi took the comfortable version of the duty and died anyway. I'd rather die reaching for the thing that took him than waiting my turn to be taken. I'm in. You already owe me a duel, Homura said. You don't get to die before I win it. I'm in. Ganta cracked his knuckles. You said you don't waste good material. Neither do I. If you've got a plan to actually win this thing, I'm not going to be the coward who sat home while you did it. I'm in. I looked at the 3 of them, and at the academy waiting to train us for a war I intended to end, and I let myself feel one quiet moment, the way I'd let myself feel the size of things before I took them apart, the strangeness of it. A boy the stone read as nothing, standing at the gate of the world's proving ground with a mage, a sword, and an axe who'd chosen to bleed beside him, on the road to the archdemon itself. I'd spent 13 years climbing alone, hidden in the dark, and now I was going to climb where the whole world could see, with people at my flank, toward the largest problem I'd ever tried to reduce. Then it's the 4 of us, I said. The hardcores. and we're going to walk into that academy and let them tell us what we can't do. I thought of the E-rank base stats the world system would read off me. The summoner buff still invisible to every holy instrument. The instructor who was going to try to expel me on sight, and the look on his face when I showed him what nothing could actually do. I smiled. And then we're going to show them. We walked through the gate the next morning, and the machine that had eaten Aoi got its first real look at the thing that had come to break it, and had absolutely no idea what it was. Every base stat read E, and Instructor Vogel moved to expel me before I'd finished stepping off the evaluation stone. The academy read its recruits the way the temple read infants a divining apparatus, grander than a priest's stone, that measured raw capacity across every attribute and printed it for the examiners to sort. Strength, agility, magic, vitality, talent grade. A 5-star like Homura lit it up so bright the examiners murmured. Rin's mage grade rang clean and high. Ganta's strength and vitality read the deep solid marks of a real axeman. I stepped on and it read E across the board. E is the floor. E is what an untrained farmhand reads, a sickly clerk, a child. Every attribute the apparatus could measure came back at the bottom of the scale, because the apparatus measured the body, and the world system still could not see the summoner buff that lived in the part of my soul the temple stone had called blank 14 years ago. On paper, I was the weakest recruit the academy had seen in a decade. Instructor Vogel was a lean, sour man who'd spent 30 years sorting the gifted from the hopeless, and prided himself on never wasting the academy's time on the second kind. He looked at my E-rank readout, and he looked at me, and he did not bother to hide his contempt. "There's been an error in the recommendations," he announced, loud enough for the whole assembled cohort to hear, because a man like Vogel enjoys an example. "Viscount Kuroda's household has sent us a servant, E-rank across every attribute. The temple recorded this one talentless." He held up my readout like evidence at a trial. "The academy trains warriors for the front, boy. We do not train the front's fodder to die faster. Collect your things. You're dismissed before you cost some real soldier the space." Rin went white with fury. Homura's hand went to her sword. Ganta actually stepped forward, and I put a hand out to stop all three of them, because I'd waited 14 years for a moment exactly this shape, and I was not going to let anyone rob me of it. "Before you dismiss me," I said, into the ringing quiet of a cohort that expected a beaten servant, "read me again. Properly. Not the body." I nodded at the apparatus. "That machine measures muscle and mana flow. It can't read a talent the temple stones couldn't read either. There's a whole category of me it's blind to. Set it to read capacity the deepest reading it has and try again." Vogel's lip curled. "The apparatus does not lie, boy." "It's not lying," I said. "It's incomplete. There's a difference, and a man who's sorted recruits for 30 years should know it." I let that land, watched it bite. "Read me deep. If I'm what the surface says, you dismiss me and I go quietly and you were right in front of everyone. If I'm not," I let the silence finish it. Something in the challenge caught him. Not fairness. Vogel had none. Vanity, the certainty that the deep reading would humiliate me further and give him a better example. He gestured curtly to the apparatus's keeper. "The full capacity reading. Let's bury this properly." The deep reading strips a soul bare, and the apparatus reached into me the way the temple stone had reached into an infant's chest 14 years ago and found a script it couldn't read. This time the machine was better than a priest's stone, and it found the script. It didn't understand it. But it measured it the summoner buff, the roster, the fused army banked in my soul, the mana reservoir I'd grown from a single point over 14 years of the hardest grind the world had never seen. And where the surface reading had printed E across a bland row, the deep reading tried to print my true capacity and simply could not fit it on the scale. The apparatus's numbers ran off the top. The keeper made a sound. Vogel leaned in with his sour certainty and watched a readout climb past S, past the marks reserved for the province's rare prodigies, past the line where the machine's designers had stopped bothering to print higher numbers because no one had ever needed them, and keep climbing, into a region the apparatus had no notation for, until it simply lit the whole board and held there, an instrument at the edge of its own measurement, trying to weigh something it wasn't built to weigh. The cohort had gone silent in the particular way a crowd goes when it doesn't understand what it's seeing, but understands that it's enormous. Vogel stared at the board, then at me, then at the board. His mouth worked, and the 30 years of certainty behind his contempt came apart in real time, and the sour, clever man who'd called me fodder in front of the whole academy found that the machine he'd sworn did not lie had just called him a fool to his face. He started. "That's not the apparatus's malfunctioning, It's incomplete," I said gently, the way you correct a child. "I did warn you." He tried the surface reading again in desperation. E, bland and low, exactly as before. He tried the deep reading again. The board lit and held past the top of its scale. The keeper protested against a third run. The deep reading costs the apparatus and shouldn't be spent on a settled dispute, but Vogel was past hearing him, not himself anymore. And the murmur that ran through the cohort was as much at the sight of a 30-year instructor forcing the machine over and over as at what it kept showing. Surface, nothing. Deep, immeasurable. And the whole cohort watched Instructor Vogel discover that both readings were true at once, that the servant he'd moved to expel was, by every meaningful measure, off the edge of the Academy's ability to rank him. I didn't gloat. I'd learned long ago that the best face slap needs no words after the machine has spoken. I just picked up the readout he'd waved like evidence, set it back on its stand, and said, "I'd like to keep my place, Instructor. If it's not too much trouble." Vogel didn't answer. He couldn't. He'd spent his contempt in front of an audience, and the world had handed it back to him with interest, and the sound the cohort made, not laughter, something more careful, the sound of 100 gifted youth recalibrating everything they'd assumed about the E-rank servant in the space of 10 breaths, was face slap enough. The hero himself was there, and I hadn't planned for that. Raidzin had come to the Academy that season the way the hero came to everything, as a symbol, to walk among the youth who'd feed the front, to be seen, to carry the impossible weight of being the one nail a continent hung its coat on. He was younger than the legends made him, weary in a way the legends never mentioned, a man in his late 20s who'd been the hero since he was a boy and had carried a 100-year war on one set of shoulders for a decade. He'd been standing at the back of the evaluation hall, unremarked in a plain cloak, watching the new cohort out of the honest habit of a man who'd learned that the front's next miracle or next corpse was always somewhere in a room like this. He'd watched the whole thing, the E-rank, the dismissal, the deep reading that ran off the top of the scale. And when the hall had emptied its shock into murmurs, the hero of the Alliance crossed the floor to a 14-year-old servant the temple had called nothing, and looked at the apparatus's board still lit past its own limit, and looked at me. And I watched the weariest man in the world go very, very still. "I've stood on that stone," Raidzin said quietly, "when I was chosen. 5 stars. They said no one had read higher in living memory." He looked at the board. At the region past S the machine couldn't name. "That reading is higher than mine, by a margin I don't have a word for." His weary eyes came to my face, searching it the way a drowning man searches for land. "Who are you?" I could have said useful. It's what I said to everyone. But this was the hero, the one man carrying the weight I'd filed under the reason, and I found I didn't want to say it to him. "Suda," I said. "Summoner. The Temple Stones can't read the class, so they call us talentless and stop looking. I've spent 14 years grinding in the dark because a summoner alone gets owned or burned." I met his gaze. "I came here to fight the war, hero. The real war, the one with Raziel at the end of it." Something moved behind Raidzin's face that I don't think he showed to many people. Hope is the wrong word. The man was too tired for hope in the bright sense. It was more like the specific, careful, terrified relief of a man who has carried something alone for so long he's forgotten it's supposed to have more than one person under it, feeling for one instant a second set of hands take part of the weight. "A summoner," he said, half to himself. "The old broken class." He almost laughed, the sound a wrung-out thing. "Off the top of the scale, and the temples called you worthless." He put his hand on my shoulder, the hero of the Alliance, to a servant boy, and his grip was heavier than it should have been, the weight of a decade in it. "Whatever you are, Suda, you're the first thing in 10 years that's made me think the archdemon might not outlive me. Don't die in this academy. The front will want you soon enough." He was right, sooner than either of us guessed. The hardcores formed for real that week, and for the first time in 14 years, I stood recognized among the strongest, instead of hidden beneath the weakest. It was strange being seen. I'd built my whole self on the mask, harmless, useless, furniture, and now the Academy knew my name, and the cohort watched me, and instructors who'd have flogged a servant a season ago sought my read on tactics. Vogel avoided me with the particular hatred of a proud man who's been proven wrong in public, and I let him because I'd already taken everything from him that I needed to, which was the last of his certainty. We drilled as a unit, and the shape of the hardcores became clear and good. I was the commander, the summoner who fielded the army, scouted the field through borrowed eyes, and struck the point no one else could reach. Rin was the sustain and the wall, her mage grade unfolding into shields and barrages that could hold a line and break one. She'd chosen the machine over safety, and she attacked her training with the fury of a girl fighting the war that took her brother. Homura was the edge, the sword, The one who closed and killed what the rest of us couldn't reach, 16 and already able to cross blades with grown knights and win. And Ganta was the anchor, the axe, the immovable comrade who held the flank while the clever work happened behind him, exactly the good material I'd told him he was. We were, the instructors admitted grudgingly, and then not grudgingly at all, the best unit the Academy had produced in years. And I still hadn't shown them a fraction of what I could actually do, because the deepest cards stayed close even now the relay, the true scale of my army, the Dragon Guardian growing in secret off the magic stones I'd been feeding it since I was 13. I let the Academy see a prodigy summoner. I did not let it see the thing I was building for Raziel. There was one quiet evening in it, in the middle of the drilling and the recognition the four of us on the wall of the Academy at dusk, tired in the good way, watching the sun go down over a training ground instead of a battlefield. Ganta had somehow acquired bread and cheese and was distributing it with the largesse of a man who'd found his place in the world. Homura was working a whetstone over a blade she didn't need to sharpen because she liked the sound of it. Rin sat close enough to me that our shoulders touched, the way she had on a back step a lifetime ago, and none of us said much of anything. "We're really going to do it, aren't we?" Homura said finally, not looking up from her blade. "The war, Raziel, the whole thing." She said it wondering, not doubting. "When we were kids in the grass, I thought the biggest thing that would ever happen was you killing that bird. And now we're—" She gestured with the whetstone at the whole world. "The hero knows your name. We're going to the front." "We're going to the front," I agreed. "Half don't come back," Ganta said, around a mouthful of bread, and it should have been grim, and somehow from him it wasn't. "So we come back." "All four. That's the plan, right?" He looked at me with the total faith of a converted doubter. "You've got a plan. You always have a plan." I looked at the three of them, a mage, a sword, an axe, who'd all chosen this with their eyes open, who'd chosen me, and at the sun going down over the last quiet evening we'd get, before the war remembered we existed. "I've got a plan," I said, and I did. It ran all the way to an archdemon that fed on the fear of routed armies, and it had a dragon at the end of it that none of them knew about yet, and it was thin in a dozen places where any of us could die. "We come back, all four. Eat your bread, Ganta." Rin's shoulder pressed a little firmer against mine in the dusk. Homura's whetstone whispered over steel. Ganta laughed at something. And I let myself, one more time, not do the arithmetic, just sit on a wall with the people I'd climbed out of the dirt to stand beside, on the edge of the largest thing I'd ever tried to take apart. The recruitment orders for the front came the next morning. The war had remembered we existed, and it had no idea what was coming for it. The front was 1,000,000 demons against a mountain wall, and I fielded tens of thousands of summons and let the enemy see 100. That was the first rule I set for myself the day we reached the war, and I want to explain it, because it's the whole difference between a general and a fool. The Alliance held a chain of fortresses across the northern mountains, the only ground where a smaller force could stop the Dark Lord's hordes, because in the passes, numbers stopped mattering and a wall became worth 10,000 men. We were assigned to Fortress Kadan, one link in that chain, garrisoned by a mixed force of human knights, dwarven axemen, and a handful of elven archers, all of them exhausted, all of them holding a line that had held for a century at the cost of everyone who'd ever held it. The first horde came on the third day. A demon assault, not the mindless goblin rabble of my barony, but the real thing, twisted war beasts and armored fiends and the shrieking lesser demons that made up Raziel's endless army, breaking against the fortress wall in a black tide that went back farther than a hawk could see. I could have won it in an afternoon. That was the terrifying truth I learned in the first assault. 14 years of grinding had made my army so vast that if I'd emptied my full roster onto that wall, the fused beasts, the raptors, the swarm scaled to the size it could reach, now I'd have broken a horde that a fortress full of veterans could barely hold. I'd become, without the world quite noticing, stronger than the war around me, and I showed them almost none of it. Because a summoner who reveals he commands tens of thousands becomes, instantly, the Alliance's most valuable and most fought-over asset, a thing to be seized by generals, claimed by kings, moved like a piece by every power in the fraying alliance, and, if the Dark Lord's spies marked him, the single target every demon lord would be ordered to kill above all others. My whole life had taught me the same lesson over and over. Keep the good things secret until you're too strong for anyone to take them. So I fielded a fraction. 100 beasts where I had thousands. Enough to matter. Enough to be the promising young summoner who turned a hard assault, not enough to reveal that a 14-year-old could break a horde alone. And in the dark, through borrowed eyes, I fought the real war no one saw. I scouted the entire front the way I'd once scouted a goblin warren. while the fortresses held their walls blind, trading blood for ground because that's all a wall can do. I flew hawks over the whole demon host and mapped at its size, its supply, the demon lords that drove it, the shape of the Dark Lord's strategy laid out below me like a board I could finally see from above. No Alliance commander in 100 years had ever had that. They fought from inside the fog of war, guessing at a horde they could only see the front edge of. I sat above it, night after night, and read it whole, and fed what I learned to the fortress commanders through Bando who'd come north with us, unwilling to let his summoner walk into a war alone, dressed as a scout's reports, so no one asked how a boy knew the enemy's disposition better than the Alliance's own spies. It changed the war at Kadan within a fortnight. Assaults that should have broken the wall were met before they landed, because I'd seen them forming 3 nights out. Reinforcements arrived where the horde meant to break through, because I'd read the breakthrough coming. The veterans started saying the fortress had gotten lucky, then that it had gotten a good commander, and the commander credited good scouting, and no one traced the scouting back to the E-rank summoner boy who never seemed to sleep. That was the pattern, and I was content with it until the front got bigger than one fortress and dragged me into the room where kings were. The Elven Queen didn't trust us, and the Dwarven Empire trusted the elves less, and I watched 100 years of grievance nearly lose the war in a single tent. The Alliance was fraying at every seam, exactly as the instructor had said. The War Council I got pulled into because a summoner who could field flying beasts and read the enemy's whole disposition had become, whatever I intended, too useful to keep at one fortress was less a council than 3 people snarling across a table. The Dwarven Empire wanted the human fortresses to hold the passes while the dwarves fortified their mountain halls, which the humans heard as let the humans die first. The elves wanted the Alliance to pull back to defensible ground, which everyone heard as abandon our lands to save yours. And the Elven Queen, cold and ancient and grieving her own century of dead, trusted the young human summoner they'd started building strategy around exactly as far as she could throw a fortress. I sat in that tent, 14 and out of my depth in the one arena I'd never trained for human politics, at the scale of kingdoms, and I did the only thing I knew how to do. I stopped trying to win the argument and started reducing it to pieces. The seam that mattered was the elven kingdom of Rosenheim, on the western edge of the front, about to be overrun. The elves wanted to abandon the whole front to save it. The dwarves and humans wanted the elves to hold the line and let Rosenheim fall, because one kingdom wasn't worth the passes. It was always arithmetic at the scale of a people a body owed, a letter to be folded, and everyone at the table had already folded Rosenheim's letter in their heads. "Don't abandon the front and don't abandon Rosenheim," I said into the snarling. "Do both. Hold the passes with the strength you have and I'll reach Rosenheim with a force fast enough to matter." I laid it out a relief cut through the demon flank, using speed the ground armies didn't have, striking the siege of Rosenheim from a direction the horde didn't defend. You lose nothing off the passes, and the elves see the Alliance bleed for their kingdom instead of folding its letter. The Elven Queen looked at me the way Vogel had looked at my E-rank readout, a human child promising the impossible. "And what force," she said, "moves fast enough to relieve a kingdom at the far western edge of the front, human? You have no such army." "I'll need to lease one," I said. "War griffins, from the Dwarven Ares." And I turned to the Dwarven envoy because I'd read this seam too. "You want the humans to prove they'll die for the Alliance before you spend Dwarven blood. Fair. Lease me your griffins and I'll prove it in the sky over Rosenheim, where every people can see it, and you spend nothing but the rental. If I fail, you've lost a fee. If I win, you've bought a century of the elves owing the dwarves, at the cost of some birds." I watched the dwarf do the arithmetic, the same cold ledger I lived in, and watched it come out in my favor, because I'd priced it in his currency. And I watched the Elven Queen watch a human child offer to bleed for her kingdom when her allies wanted to fold its letter, and I watched a crack open in 100 years of her distrust. "Lease him the griffins," she said slowly. "To me, if you save Rosenheim, summoner, the elves will remember. We remember for a very long time." A pause, ancient and weighing. "And if this is a boy's boast, we will remember that too." "It's not a boast, Your Majesty," I said. "It's a plan. I don't make boasts. They don't have numbers in them." I relieved Rosenheim from the sky, and it was the first time the whole Alliance saw what I could do, and I still showed them only half. The War Griffins let me move a real force fast my fused beasts and swarm carried on Griffin back, and on my own flying summons across the flank the horde didn't defend, striking the siege of Rosenheim from above and behind at dawn. And because a kingdom's survival was worth revealing more than a single fortress, I opened up wider than I ever had on that front. Not the full roster, never the full roster, Not with the Dragon Guardian still my secret and the true scale still my armor, but thousands of summons where I'd been fielding hundreds. A sky full of raptors and a ground swarm that rolled up the siege from a direction it couldn't turn to face. The elves inside Rosenheim, who'd resigned themselves to their letter being folded, watched a human child descend out of the dawn with an army of beasts and break a siege the Alliance had written off. I fought that relief through the relay, 4 bodies and then 6, riding hawks and wolf bears and the lead griffins all at once, commanding a battle across the whole sky over an elven kingdom while my true body sat guarded in a forward camp near the flank bando, standing over it, the one man I trusted to keep my slack self safe while I was gone into a dozen borrowed eyes. Rosenheim held, the siege broke, and the elven queen, who remembered for a very long time, watched a human child spend himself to the edge of collapse for a kingdom her allies had abandoned, and the crack in her century of distrust became a door. The Alliance stopped fraying a little that week. 3 peoples who'd snarled across a table saw a summoner bleed for all of them without asking whose he was, and the shared thing that held them together against the dark got, for the first time in years, a little stronger. I hadn't set out to mend the Alliance. I'd set out to reduce a problem. But you cannot reach an archdemon across a fractured alliance, and mending the seam was one of the pieces, so I'd mended it and filed it done. I learned Raziel's weakness from a demon lord's dying mind, and it was the piece the whole plan had been missing. Because I don't leave the enemy's whole disposition mapped and stop at the front edge. I'd been reading the Horde for a season, and reading meant riding my summons close enough to the demon lords to catch, sometimes the shape of their intent, and when my beasts killed a demon lord in the Rosenheim relief, I did the thing I'd learned to do with the minds of the things I killed. I rode its dying senses for the 1 second they lasted, and in that second, I caught the shape of what the demon lords feared and served, and I caught the thing that no Alliance commander in 100 years had ever been positioned to learn. Raziel fed on fear, not metaphorically. The archdemon grew stronger from the terror and chaos of routed armies. That was why the war never ended, why every Alliance offensive that broke and fled made the next one harder, why 100 years of throwing massed armies at Raziel had only fed it. Every time an army routed in fear before it, the archdemon drank the panic and swelled, and the Alliance's own strategy mass the host, charge the demon, break in terror when the charge failed was the exact thing that had kept Raziel unkillable for a century. They'd been feeding it. Every general who'd ever led a great terrified army at the archdemon had made it stronger by the trying. Which meant the way to kill Raziel was the opposite of everything the Alliance had tried. Not a massed army to break and feed it. A small, disciplined, unafraid force, one that fought as a scalpel and never routed, that gave the archdemon no panic to drink while the killing was done by a strike it couldn't have braced for. I sat with that after Rosenheim, exhausted past speech, and I felt the last piece of a plan I'd been building since a backstep in a grieving barony slide into place. I knew how to reach Raziel now. I knew why no one else could. And I knew, finally, what the Dragon Guardian I'd been growing in secret for years had been for. They chose the hardcores for the final assault, and the odds were even, and I revealed none of my true reserve. The campaign had run the better part of a year by then. The fortresses, Rosenheim, the long grind of a front that finally, for the first time in a century, was gaining ground instead of losing it. The Alliance, mended enough to try, massed for the thing it hadn't dared in a decade, a strike at Raziel itself, while the archdemon was drawn out at the head of its host in the Rosenheim campaign's wake. Raidzin would lead it, the hero, the one nail, binding the archdemon in open combat the way only a 5-star could. And around him, a chosen force small enough not to feed the thing and strong enough to matter, and the hardcores were named to it, because a summoner who'd relieved Rosenheim and read the enemy's whole war had become the Alliance's sharpest edge. 50-50, the commanders said, an even chance, a century of war on a coin. I let them believe it was even, because the last card had to stay hidden until the instant it fell. The night before the assault, I went alone to the deep place I'd kept my greatest secret, and I looked at the thing I'd been growing since I was 13. Not a summon from the roster? A masterwork, a guardian I'd raised over years by feeding it thousands of magic stones, the harvested cores that every cleared warren, the orc horde, and now every demon lord killed on the front had poured into it. A beast grown card by card and stone by stone into something that had no rank on any scale because I'd built it outside the scales. A dragon, my dragon. The one reserve I'd never shown a living soul, not Bando, not Rin, not the hero, the piece I'd been saving for exactly one target for as long as I'd known Raziel had to die. The front had fed it faster than any grind ever could. A season of slain demon lords had done more for it than years of warrens. I looked at it in the dark, the way I'd once looked at a single point of mana in a crib, and I did the last arithmetic. To wake it and field it would cost me nearly everything my whole mana reserve, the vessel spent to its edge, the kind of overdraw that had left me bleeding on a hillside at 13, magnified 100-fold. I could unleash the Dragon Guardian exactly once, for one blow, and it would empty me completely, and if that blow didn't land, I'd have nothing left, and the assault would fail, and the war would go on eating Aoi after Aoi forever. The whole century came down to one strike I'd been building my entire life toward. All four come back, Ganta had said. That's the plan, right? I let the dragon sleep one more night, and I climbed back up to where the hardcores waited, and I looked at the three of them, the mage, the sword, the axe, my family from the dirt, and at the hero, and at the horde fog on the northern horizon where an archdemon that had never known fear was about to meet the thing I'd grown in the dark to teach it some. We come back, I said. All four. I've got a plan. And for the first time in 14 years, I let myself feel how far the lake had come from the puddle, a boy the stone read as nothing, standing at the edge of ending a 100-year war with an army no one could see, and a dragon no one knew existed, and three people at his side who'd chosen him out of the grass. Then I stopped feeling it, and started, coldly, carefully, to take the archdemon apart. The battle for Raziel lasted 7 days, and it went exactly as I'd planned, right up until the part where I had to bet my life on the thing I'd grown in the dark. The plan was the opposite of everything a century of war had tried, and I'd sold it to the Alliance commanders through Raidzin, because a hero saying we fight small and we do not rout was believed where a summoner boy saying it was not. No massed army to break and feed the archdemon its favorite meal. A scalpel. Raidzin at the point, binding Raziel in open combat the way only a 5-star could hold a thing that had never been held. The hardcores as the disciplined core that would not panic, would not rout, would give the archdemon no terror to drink. And the Alliance's great host held back at the passes as a wall, not a charge, so that nowhere on that field was there a rooting army to make Raziel stronger. We starved it. That was the shape of the 7 days. For a century, every offensive had fed the thing, and now, for the first time, an assault came at it that gave it nothing to eat, a small hard core that took ground and held it and did not break. So the archdemon that had swelled on 100 years of panic found itself, day by day, growing no stronger, while the thing that binds it wore it down. The hardcores held the flanks of that scalpel, and I have never been prouder of anything I built. Homura held the left, and she was magnificent, and she never once looked afraid. That was her job, not just to hold, but to hold unafraid, visibly, because Raziel fed on the fear, and a swordswoman who laughed on the line starved it. And Homura, 16 and finally grown into the 5-star talent she'd spent her whole life half ashamed she hadn't earned, held the left flank of the assault against demon lords with a grin on her face, and every fiend that came at her died on a blade that had been sharpening itself on a whetstone since we were children in the grass. She'd spent 7 years afraid she was only good because the gods decided it. On that flank, she stopped being afraid of that too, because you cannot fake what she did for 7 days, and she knew it, and it burned the last of the insecurity out of her. Ganta held the right, and the loud scared boy from the grass became a wall no demon crossed. He was the anchor, the immovable comrade. The axeman I'd told was good material, standing in the exact spot where the assault would break if anyone broke, and Ganta did not break, because a converted doubter has something a natural hero doesn't: the memory of having been wrong, and the fury to never be the coward again. He held the right flank of an assault on the archdemon with a smith's stubbornness and an axe he'd half-forged himself, and when the demon lords tried to fold our letter, he simply refused to let them, and the whole scalpel held because its edges held. Rin held the center, and she held all of us alive. Her mage grade had unfolded into the thing the plan needed most: a shield dome, vast and sustained, that she held over the core of the assault so that Raziel's reign of hellfire and horror broke against a barrier instead of a routing army. She held the dome in shifts, dropping into short snatches of sleep while the front's other mages caught the edge of it, but the heart of it was her will, hour after hour, day after day, and no one else could hold the center of it the way she did. It cost her more than anything cost anyone. A shield that size drank her to the edge of collapse and past it, and she held it anyway, because the girl who'd chosen the machine over safety on a back step had decided she would not fold Aoi's letter for anyone, not even herself. Every time she flagged, I'd feel it from wherever I was in the field, and send a beast to her side with the whey bread and water I'd learned to never fight without, and she'd eat and drink without stopping the shield and hold it another hour, and another. 7 days. She held the heart of the dome by her own will for 7 days. And I did the thing no one else on that field could do. I found the flaw. Raziel was armored, and the armor was the problem, and I read it through the eyes of dozens of summons where the hero's holy blade could only strike its surface. That was the second half of why a century of war had failed. Even when the Alliance reached the Archdemon, even when a hero got a blade on it, Raziel's hide turned every blow a shell of demon flesh and hell-forged plate that Rydzen's holy sword scored and could not crack. You could bind it, you could wear it. You could not open it, and a thing you cannot open cannot be killed, and so every hero for 100 years had died on its skin. I opened it with my eyes. While Rydzen bound it and the hardcores held the field, I flew the relay harder than I'd ever flown anything, not 4 bodies, not 6, but dozens. A whole cloud of small summons wheeling around the Archdemon at every angle, each one a camera, each one feeding me the shape of a thing too vast for any single vantage to see whole. My true body lay guarded deep in the assault's core under Rin's dome, Bando standing over it with his sword drawn the way he'd stood over it at Rosenheim, and I left it there and became a swarm of eyes, and I read Raziel's armor plate by plate across 7 days the way I'd once read a goblin warren tunnel by tunnel. And on the 6th day I found it. Every armor has a seam. Raziel's was at the joint of its left shoulder, where the hell plate met the demon flesh, a hand's width of hide where the shell couldn't fully cover the movement of the limb, a flaw the Archdemon had defended for a century by never letting anything get the angle to see it whole. Rydzen, binding it face on, couldn't see it. No single fighter could. It took a cloud of eyes at every angle at once to map the seam, and I was the only creature in 100 years of war who'd ever had a cloud of eyes. I marked it, and I gathered everything for the one blow. I broke the seam with hundreds of beasts striking one point in unison, and it cracked a defense the hero's holy blade couldn't. A hand's width of hide, on a moving Archdemon, guarded by its own limb, no single strike could reach it, and a scattered assault would just feed the thing more fear. So I did the thing I'd been doing since a ruck hawk on a spear. I struck one point all at once, with everything I had. Not scattered across the field, concentrated, hundreds of my fused beasts and raptors converging on that single seam in one coordinated instant, timed off the dozens of eyes that could see the Archdemon's motion whole, so that the one heartbeat the seam opened in Raziel's movement was the heartbeat hundreds of my summons hit it together. The Archdemon's armor cracked. A defense a century of heroes had died on, opened by a talentless summoner's swarm, at a seam no one else could see, in an instant no one else could time. It cost me most of my army to do it. Raziel killed my beasts by the hundreds. A swipe of that limb erased a dozen at a time, and I spent them like water, because they were the setup, the way the wolf bears at the marsh had been the setup, the way everything I'd ever built had been the setup for one strike at the point where a monster couldn't strike back. The seam opened. The Archdemon that had never been wounded in 100 years took its first wound, a crack in the shell at its shoulder, and Raziel screamed not in fear, it didn't have fear, but in a rage that shook the field, because for the first time in a century, something had reached it. And a crack is not a kill. Rydzen's holy blade could reach the wound now, but the Archdemon was too vast and too enraged, and a scored seam is not a slain god, and this was the instant I'd built my whole life toward. I woke the dragon. I spent nearly my entire mana reserve in one breath, and the thing I'd grown in the dark for years came into the world. I'd been feeding it since I was 13, the cores that every cleared warren, the orc horde, and, on the front, every demon lord I killed had poured into it, thousands of magic stones, and the war itself had swollen it faster than any grind ever could. A season of slain demon lords had done more for it than years of warrens. It was a masterwork, a guardian raised card by card outside every scale the world could measure, my one true secret shown to no one, saved for exactly this. And on the 7th day of the battle for Raziel, with the Archdemon's armor cracked and the hero's blade waiting and every eye on the field on the wound at its shoulder, I emptied myself completely and called it. The Dragon Guardian came into being over the battlefield like a second sky. I'd known it was large. I hadn't let myself feel how large until it was real above me, blotting the sun, a thing I'd grown from nothing the way I'd grown everything from nothing, from a single point of mana in a crib to this, and the whole field, alliance and horde alike, stopped for one heartbeat to look up at the thing the talentless boy had hidden. Rydzen looked up. Rin, under her dome, looked up. Homura and Ganta on their flanks looked up. And Raziel, cracked and enraged, turned its ancient eyes up at the one thing on the field it had never accounted for. The dragon struck the seam. Everything I had left went into that one blow the vessel spent past its edge, my nose bleeding, my body convulsing where it lay under Rin's dome, the overdraw that had left me broken on a hillside at 13 magnified, until I felt my own life go thin, and the Dragon Guardian drove into the crack my hundreds of beasts had opened, into the one wound in a century of armor, and tore it wide, ripping the seam from a hand's width to a chasm, opening the archdemon's shoulder to the flesh beneath, in a wound no shell now covered. And through that wound, Raidzin landed the killing strike. That was always the shape of it. Not the dragon killing Raziel, not me killing Raziel, the hero killing Raziel, through the opening I'd made, because the plan was never I win alone. I'd spent my whole life learning that you don't have to be stronger than the monster. You have to be smarter about where it stands when it dies, and who's holding the blade at that spot. I cracked the armor with a swarm. I tore it open with a dragon. And the one nail a continent had hung its coat on for 10 years drove a holy blade through the wound into the archdemon's heart, and the thing that had eaten the young of 3 peoples for 100 years finally died. The war turned to humanity for the first time in a century, in a single afternoon, on a seam no one else could see. I don't remember the end of the battle because I'd spent myself to nothing, and my body gave out the instant the dragon's blow landed. I woke 3 days later in a healer's tent, wrung out past anything I'd ever felt, my mana a dry well, my body billed to the last coin for the overdraw and alive, because Rin had held her dome over my slack body through the whole finish, and Bando had carried me off the field, and Homura and Ganta had held the flanks until there was nothing left to hold because Raziel was dead and its leaderless horde had come apart into the panicking rabble I'd known how to harvest since I was 13. All 4 came back, that was the plan. The hardcores stood around my cot when I woke Homura with her arm in a sling and her grin intact. Ganta with a new scar and a laugh too big for a tent. Rin so drained she could barely stand and refusing to sit down until I opened my eyes. And when I did, she made the startled, undignified Kuroda laugh that was half a sob. And Ganta said, "You've got a plan," he says. "You always have a plan." And Homura said, "You still owe me a duel, so don't you dare have died." And I lay there having ended a 100-year war and thought, I have never in 2 lives been richer than this. The king offered me a dukedom, and I asked for one thing instead, and it was the only thing I'd ever really been climbing toward. They wanted to make me the greatest lord in the realm. The summoner who killed the archdemon, the boy who ended the century of Warland title, a duke's coronet, a place at the highest table of a saved civilization. Raidzin himself spoke for it, the hero insisting the alliance owed me everything it had. And I looked at the whole comfortable summit of the world laid out on a table the way the Baron had once laid out a captaincy, and I refused it, the way I'd refused every cage the world had ever offered me dressed as a gift. "I don't want a dukedom, your majesty," I said. "I want one thing, and it costs you nothing, and it's the only payment I'll take." I looked at the king of a saved realm. Recognize the summoner talent. Officially. Have the temples read it into the stones, name it a true gift, open a faculty at the academy to train it. So that the next child born with what I was born with isn't pressed to a stone that calls him nothing and thrown into the dirt for 14 years. I held his gaze. That's my price. Not land. Just that no child is ever branded worthless again for carrying what killed your archdemon. The king agreed. Of course he agreed. I'd priced it in his currency, the way I priced everything a debt of a century's war repaid with a stroke of a pen and the founding of a faculty. The temples were ordered to read the summoner glyph as a true talent. The academy opened a summoner's hall. And the caste stain that had buried me in the dirt of a serf's village was struck from the world, so that somewhere, in some backwater, the next child the stone couldn't read would be handed a future instead of a cage. I'd looked up at the machine that ate Ioi on a back step in a grieving barony, and I'd filed break that under the reason, and I'd broken it. The war was over. And the last, smallest, most important piece of it that no child pay what I'd paid was done with a signature, and it was worth more to me than any dukedom in the realm. I went home,